Hello there, and welcome to Secretum Histories. Tonight, we settle into something older than memory as it's usually told, older than the habit of calling a beginning the first thing that happened. This is a quiet place to spend some time, a place where history does not hurry, where explanations are allowed to unfold at their own pace, and where the past is approached carefully, without spectacle, without urgency, and without the pressure to arrive anywhere quickly. What we're exploring together is not a discovery in the modern sense, not a revelation pulled suddenly into the light, but a pattern that has been sitting in the open for thousands of years. It's a pattern that appears in clay tablets pressed by hands long turned to dust, copied and recopied by scribes who never explained why they wrote what they wrote, only that it mattered enough to preserve. These texts never announce their intentions. They don't declare a thesis or argue a case. They simply speak quietly and consistently, in a voice that assumes the listener already knows more than we think we do. The idea we're easing into tonight is simple on the surface and unsettling once it settles. The Sumerians, the earliest people we know to have written extensively about their world, did not describe themselves as the first civilization. They didn't frame their cities as the dawn of human order. They didn't speak as pioneers standing at the edge of chaos. Instead, they wrote as inheritors, as occupants of a world that had already been shaped, already ordered, already worn smooth by something that came before them. This is not a modern reinterpretation imposed from the outside. It's not a theory built by rearranging fragments to fit a preferred narrative. It's something that emerges naturally when the texts are allowed to remain intact, when they are read slowly, when their silences are taken as seriously as their statements, when their assumptions are examined instead of ignored. The Sumerian record does not begin with creation. It begins after creation. It does not open with humans learning how to live. It opens with systems already in place. Kingship exists before kings are named. Cities exist before their founding is described. Knowledge is presented as received rather than invented. Authority descends instead of rising. Even the gods themselves arrive into a world that is already functioning according to rules that no one bothers to explain. This tone of continuation runs through everything. It appears in the way time is measured. It appears in the way genealogies are constructed. It appears in the way disasters are described as resets rather than endings. Most striking of all, it appears in the way the past is segmented, not into a single line, but into layers. There are moments in the texts where time stretches unnaturally long. Reigns last tens of thousands of years. Generations blur into epochs. Then, abruptly, everything contracts. Lifespans shorten. Authority fragments. The rhythm of existence changes. The scribes never pause to justify this shift. They simply record it, as if anyone listening would already understand why the world no longer works the way it once did. Later traditions would call this myth. Modern readers often dismiss it as symbolism. But the Sumerians themselves never draw that line. They do not distinguish between what we would call historical time and what we would call mythic time. To them, it is all part of the same record, the same inheritance, the same sequence of worlds. The suggestion that we're not the first civilization does not come from a single line or tablet. It emerges from repetition, from consistency, from the way certain ideas are treated as obvious rather than remarkable. When the king list opens by stating that kingship descended from heaven, it is not presented as an extraordinary claim. It is presented as background information. When cities are named as existing before the flood, no effort is made to explain how they were built or by whom. When the flood arrives, it does not wipe the slate clean in the way later traditions might suggest. It draws a boundary. Everything before it is different. Everything after it is diminished. What we're doing here is not declaring certainty. It is not assigning numbers recklessly or inventing lost worlds for the sake of intrigue. Instead, it is paying attention to how the Sumerians themselves organized their understanding of time. When their texts are read carefully, a pattern emerges that resembles cycles rather than a single origin, phases rather than a beginning. successive conditions of existence, each one complete in its own way, each one ending without explanation. In this framework, civilization is not a singular achievement. It is a recurring state, something that arises, stabilizes, reaches a form of completeness, and then disappears or is altered so profoundly that it might as well have vanished. What follows is not a continuation, but a reoccupation. The same land, the same rivers, the same stars overhead, but under different rules. The Sumerians never list these worlds explicitly. They never say, this was the first, this was the second, and so on. That kind of clarity belongs to modern categorization, not ancient record keeping. Instead, they leave markers, changes in time, changes in lifespan, changes in how close the divine is allowed to come, changes in how much knowledge is remembered versus how much must be relearned. If we trace those markers carefully, 6 distinct conditions of civilization appear before the one the Sumerians inhabited. Not 6 named empires, not 6 cultures we could map archaeologically. 6 stages of human order, each defined by how time behaves, how authority functions, and how closely humans exist to forces beyond themselves. The earliest of these is barely described at all. It exists as implication, a condition in which order precedes narrative, where the universe is structured but uninhabited by recognizable actors. It is a world before gods have personalities, before humans have roles, before anything requires explanation. This is not creation as an event, but existence as a state. The second introduces differentiation. Heaven and earth are named. Boundaries appear. Space becomes meaningful. This is still not a human world, but it is no longer undivided. It is stable, but not populated in any familiar sense. The third brings divine presence into focus. Gods appear not as creators, but as administrators. They inherit domains. They take on responsibilities. They are born into an order rather than forming it. This is a world governed, but not yet shared. The fourth is where time begins to stretch, where rulers exist whose lifespans defy modern comprehension. Cities function without recorded origins. Work is done, food is grown, laws are implied. This is the world of the antediluvian kings, though even that label is misleading. It's not a single age, but a condition where longevity and proximity to the divine are normal. The fifth ends quietly. There is no collapse narrative, no moral explanation. It simply stops. The transition is implied rather than described. Names continue, but the rules change. Lifespans shorten. Memory thins. The sixth is the immediate predecessor to the Sumerian age. It is the world remembered through fragments, through lists, through damaged tablets. It is close enough to feel familiar, but distant enough to feel unreachable. This is the civilization that ends with the flood, not as punishment, but as reset. And then there is the seventh, the world the Sumerians recognize as their own, a world where humans must work harder, where knowledge must be preserved deliberately, where the divine withdraws slightly, becoming more symbolic, more ritualized, less present. A world where history begins to resemble what we recognize as history. This is not framed as progress. The Sumerians never suggest they are better off than those who came before. In many ways, the opposite is implied. Shorter lives, less certainty, greater distance from the sources of order. Civilization persists, but it does so under constraints that did not previously exist. What follows from this understanding is not despair and not superiority, but humility. The awareness that civilization is fragile, that it has failed before, that it may not be permanent, that what we inherit is always partial, filtered through loss and silence. As we continue, we'll move slowly through each of these conditions, not as chapters, not as segments, but as layers of the same story. We'll stay close to the texts, We'll avoid speculation that cannot be supported by the record. We'll allow ambiguity to remain where the Sumerians themselves left it unresolved. Nothing here requires belief, only attention, only patience, only a willingness to let ancient voices speak without forcing them to answer questions they were never trying to address. For now, settle into the idea that the past may be deeper than we usually allow, that civilization may not be a singular achievement, but a recurring one, and that the Sumerians, quietly and without emphasis, may have been telling us all along that they were not the first to build a world, only the seventh to inherit what remained. The reason the Sumerians never claimed to be the first is not hidden in a single line, nor stated outright in a way that satisfies modern expectations. It is woven into how they speak about themselves at every level, from kingship to cities, from knowledge to time itself. The absence of a claim matters more than any declaration could. When a culture believes it stands at the beginning of everything, it tends to say so. It celebrates invention. It marks firsts. It frames itself as a point of origin. The Sumerian texts do none of this. Instead, they speak with the calm certainty of people who have arrived somewhere already prepared for them. From the earliest tablets we possess, the Sumerians write as if the world has a history before them that does not need defending or explaining. They do not introduce their cities as new experiments. They do not describe the discovery of agriculture, writing, or law as breakthroughs achieved through trial and error. These things simply exist. They are already present, already functional, already embedded in the fabric of daily life. The tone is not celebratory. It is administrative. Systems are described, not invented. Roles are inherited, not negotiated. This becomes especially clear when we look at how kingship is treated. In later cultures, kings often justify their authority by tracing it back to a founder, a conquest, or a heroic ancestor. In Sumerian texts, kingship does not begin with a person at all. It descends. That single verb carries immense weight. Kingship is not created by humans. It does not arise from social need or political struggle. It comes down from elsewhere, fully formed, already legitimate. The first king is not portrayed as an innovator, but as a recipient. He receives authority the way land receives rain, without choice and without authorship. This framing alone undermines any claim to being first. You cannot be the first civilization if your most basic institution arrives from beyond you. Authority that descends implies an earlier structure that existed long enough to generate it. Something must already be in place for kingship to be transferred. The Sumerians do not ask where that structure came from. They treat it as given. The same attitude appears in their treatment of cities. When cities are named in the texts, they are not introduced with founding myths in the way later traditions would develop. There is no moment of settlement described, no struggle against wilderness, no heroic act of construction. Cities simply are. They exist before the narratives begin. Eridu, Uruk, Nippur and others appear as established centres, already sacred, already integrated into divine order. Their origins are not commemorated because, from the Sumerian perspective, their origins lie outside the scope of ordinary history. Even when the texts look backward, they do not search for a beginning. They search for continuity. Lists are compiled. Lineages are preserved. Names are copied across centuries. The act of preservation itself becomes more important than explanation. This is not the behaviour of a culture concerned with proving primacy. It is the behaviour of a culture concerned with maintaining inheritance. Language reinforces this constantly. Knowledge is never framed as discovery. It is framed as remembrance. Scribes are not innovators. They are caretakers. Their task is not to create meaning, but to prevent it from being lost. When instructions are given, they're often attributed to divine sources or ancient precedents rather than human ingenuity. Even writing itself is treated as something bestowed, not developed. If the Sumerians believed they were the first civilization, we would expect anxiety about legitimacy. we would expect assertions of uniqueness. We would expect a strong emphasis on beginnings. Instead, we find the opposite. A quiet confidence that suggests they are standing somewhere in the middle of a much longer sequence. Their treatment of time makes this even clearer. Time, in the Sumerian worldview, is not uniform. It does not flow at a consistent rate from a single starting point. It expands and contracts. Early periods stretch into immense spans. Later ones compress. This is not symbolic exaggeration in the modern sense. It is a way of indicating different conditions of existence. When the texts describe reigns lasting tens of thousands of years, they are not merely inflating numbers. They are marking a qualitative difference, a time when life operated under rules no longer accessible. Crucially, these long ages are not framed as primitive or incomplete. They are not portrayed as chaotic preludes to proper civilization. They are stable, ordered, governed. Cities exist. Kings rule. The divine is present. If anything, these periods appear more complete than later ones. When time shortens, it is not progress. It is loss. This inversion is important. Modern narratives tend to place progress at the end of a timeline. The Sumerians place fullness toward the beginning. The farther back one looks, the more expansive and integrated the world becomes. Humans live longer. Authority is clearer. The boundary between divine and mortal is thinner. As time moves forward, conditions tighten, lives shorten, knowledge fragments. The world becomes more difficult to manage. This structure leaves no room for a claim of being first. The Sumerians saw themselves as living after something greater, not before it. Their age is defined by limitation. Mortality becomes fixed. Labour becomes harder. Divine presence becomes ritualized rather than direct. These are not the markers of a beginning. They are the markers of a later phase. The flood plays a central role in this perception, but not in the way it is often misunderstood. The flood is not presented as the start of civilization. It is presented as a boundary between conditions. Everything before it belongs to a different order of existence. Everything after it must adapt to new constraints. The flood does not create the world, it reshapes it. What matters is that the flood does not erase memory entirely. Names remain, lists survive. Knowledge is preserved in fragments. This implies intention. Someone wanted the past to be remembered, even if it could not be restored. The Sumerians inherit this memory. They do not invent it. This inherited memory carries with it a sense of humility. The Sumerians do not present themselves as the pinnacle of achievement. They do not describe their cities as unsurpassable. They do not claim that order begins with them. Instead, they emphasize responsibility. Maintaining what has been handed down becomes the central task. Civilization is something that can fail, something that has failed before. Even their gods are not originators in the absolute sense. The divine hierarchy itself has a history. Gods are born, roles shift, authority is negotiated. The earliest deities emerge from conditions that are never fully explained. This again points backward. Even the gods inherit a structure. All of this produces a worldview in which being first would be an odd claim to make. First implies novelty. It implies uncertainty. It implies trial and error. The Sumerians saw their world as already tested, already worn, already shaped by cycles of emergence and collapse. Their role was not to begin, but to continue. The silence around origins is therefore deliberate, even if not consciously so. It reflects a deep assumption that origins lie beyond reach, that what matters is not how something began, but how it is sustained. When beginnings are mentioned at all, they are abstract, cosmic, removed from human agency. Human history begins after those moments, already downstream. This is why later cultures that inherited Mesopotamian traditions often struggled with them. As narratives moved westward and centuries passed, there was a growing desire to locate a single starting point, to compress time, to assign blame or virtue, to make history linear. But the earliest layers resist this. They refuse to cooperate with a simple origin story. The Sumerians did not need to claim they were first because, within their own understanding, being first was neither possible nor desirable. They lived in a world defined by succession. Each age inherits what it can and loses what it must. To stand somewhere in that sequence is not a failure. It is the natural condition of existence. As we move forward from here, this quiet refusal to claim primacy becomes more than a cultural quirk. It becomes a clue. If the Sumerians never claimed to be the first, it may be because they knew, in ways they did not feel compelled to articulate, that they were not. And if that knowledge shaped how they wrote, ruled, and remembered, then it shapes what we're about to examine next, where language itself begins to reveal a world that does not start but resumes. The Sumerian texts speak in a voice that does not announce itself. They do not open with declarations. They do not pause to explain why something matters. They assume a listener who is already oriented, already familiar with the shape of the world being described. This assumption is not accidental. It is built directly into the language itself. From the earliest compositions to the later copies made centuries afterward, the words chosen by Sumerian scribes consistently point forward rather than backward. They describe what continues, not what begins. This is one of the most easily overlooked aspects of the record, precisely because it feels so subtle. Modern readers are trained to look for starting points. We search for phrases that signal origin, invention, or discovery. We expect stories to tell us how something came into existence. When that information is missing, we often assume it was lost, forgotten, or considered unimportant. In the Sumerian case, the absence is not a gap. It is a feature. The language of the tablets is built around verbs that imply maintenance, repetition, and transfer. Things are established, upheld, restored, renewed. Rarely are they created in the sense of being brought into existence for the first time. When creation is mentioned, it tends to occur at a cosmic level, removed from human involvement and already completed by the time human affairs come into focus. By the time people appear, the world is already operating. Even the way time is referenced reinforces this. Events are not framed as unprecedented. They're framed as part of an ongoing order. Phrases equivalent to "in those days" or "at that time" appear frequently, but they do not mark beginnings. They situate actions within a flow that is already underway. The listener is not being invited to witness the start of something, but to observe how it functions within an established pattern. This becomes particularly clear when we examine how the Sumerians describe law, ritual, and social structure. Laws are not introduced as new solutions to emerging problems. They are described as reaffirmations of proper order. Rituals are not invented to appease the gods for the first time. They are performed because that is what has always been done. Deviations are noteworthy. Continuity is assumed. The same pattern appears in myths that modern readers often treat as origin stories. When a god assigns roles to other gods, the language suggests organization rather than creation. When humans are formed, it is not presented as the birth of humanity into an empty world. It is a response to an existing situation, a labor problem, a disruption in balance. Humans are introduced as a corrective measure, not as the start of a new era. This distinction matters. A beginning implies intention. It implies a clear line separating what came before from what follows. Continuation implies inheritance. It implies obligation. It implies that the present is shaped by decisions and conditions that are no longer accessible. The Sumerian texts overwhelmingly favour the second mode. Even the way genealogies are constructed reflects this orientation. Lists of gods, kings, or cities rarely start from an absolute zero. They start from a point that is already meaningful. A god is named as the child of another god whose own origin is left unexplained. A king is listed as reigning in a city whose founding is not described. The list itself becomes the point. The act of naming preserves continuity. This preservation is not neutral, it carries authority. To record something is to affirm that it belongs within the order of things. Scribes understood this. Their role was not to speculate about origins, but to safeguard what had been handed down. The language they used reflects that responsibility. It is careful, repetitive, conservative. It resists novelty. When something truly new does appear, it is treated with caution. Sudden changes are often associated with disruption or loss. The flood is the clearest example, but it is not unique. Moments when order shifts are marked by instability. They are not celebrated, they are endured. The language becomes tense, compressed, sometimes fragmentary. Afterward, there is an effort to re-establish what was broken, not to create something entirely different. This is why the Sumerian worldview feels so different from later traditions that emphasize creation ex nihilo, or the idea of a definitive beginning. In those frameworks, language is oriented toward origins. Words are chosen to explain how something came to be. In the Sumerian framework, language is oriented toward continuity. Words are chosen to explain how something remains. This orientation affects even how knowledge itself is described. Wisdom is not discovered. It is revealed, taught, remembered, or recovered. The implication is that it already existed in some form. Humans gain access to it temporarily. They do not own it. This is why loss of knowledge is such a persistent theme. What has been forgotten is not gone because it was never there, but because it was once present and then slipped out of reach. The structure of Sumerian narratives reinforces this again and again. Stories often begin in the middle of events. Characters appear with established roles. Conflicts arise from disturbances to an existing balance, not from the absence of order. Resolution, when it occurs, involves restoring alignment rather than forging something entirely new. Even the gods operate within this framework. They argue, negotiate, and enforce rules that already exist. They are powerful, but they are not omnipotent in the modern sense. They are bound by precedents. They respect decrees. They work within a system that predates individual actions. This gives the divine realm a sense of history rather than timelessness. The effect of all this is subtle but profound. When language consistently avoids beginnings, it shapes how reality itself is understood. Existence becomes something layered. The present rests on unseen foundations. The past is not a single point but a depth. This depth is never fully mapped. The Sumerians do not attempt to catalogue every prior condition. They do not number civilizations. They do not label ages sequentially. Instead, they leave indicators, shifts in lifespan, changes in divine proximity, alterations in how time is measured. These are linguistic signals rather than explicit statements. For example, when rain lengths suddenly become shorter after the flood, the text does not explain why this happens. It simply records the change. The assumption is that the reason is already known or does not need articulation. The language treats the shift as a given, not as a mystery to be solved. This way of writing can feel frustrating to modern readers. We want clarity. We want explicit explanations. But that frustration itself is instructive. It reveals a different relationship between language and reality. For the Sumerians, language was not a tool for uncovering ultimate origins. It was a means of stabilizing the present by anchoring it to what came before. This is why the claim of being first never appears. To claim primacy would require a language of beginnings. It would require emphasis on novelty. It would require a break with the past. The Sumerians did not write that way because they did not think that way. Their world was not something that had recently begun. It was something that had survived. Their task was not to explain how it started, but to ensure it continued. The language they used reflects that task at every level. As we move further into this exploration, this linguistic orientation becomes increasingly important. It affects how we read the king lists. It shapes how we interpret divine genealogies. It changes how we understand catastrophic events. The absence of beginnings is not an oversight, it is a signal. The Sumerian texts are not trying to tell us where everything started. They are telling us where we are standing. And where we are standing, according to their language, is never at the beginning. It is always somewhere after, on ground that has already been walked, shaped, and altered by lives and systems that left only partial traces behind. This understanding prepares us for what comes next, where authority itself does not rise gradually from human effort, but appears fully formed, arriving from elsewhere, reinforcing the idea that civilization does not begin so much as it arrives into an already moving stream, carrying with it the weight of everything that came before and the quiet expectation that it will not be the last to do so. When the Sumerian texts speak about authority, they do so without hesitation and without justification. There is no debate recorded about who should rule, no account of councils formed by humans, no memory of leadership gradually emerging from necessity or strength. Instead, authority appears already complete. It arrives as a finished structure. Kingship, in the Sumerian understanding, does not grow upward from the ground. It comes down from above. This idea is so central and so calmly stated that it is easy to miss its implications. The phrase itself appears repeatedly in the king list and related texts, written in slightly different forms but always carrying the same assumption. Kingship descends from heaven. It is not requested. It is not earned. It is not invented. It is transferred. That single concept reshapes how we must understand the Sumerian view of civilization. In later historical thinking, kingship is often treated as a response to social complexity. Populations grow, resources must be managed, conflicts arise, and leadership emerges to impose order. In the Sumerian record, this entire process is bypassed. Order precedes society. Authority precedes administration. The king is not the solution to chaos. He is the expression of an order that already exists. What descends is not merely the right to rule, it is the institution itself. Kingship arrives with its expectations, its rituals, its responsibilities, and its limits already defined. The king does not shape kingship. Kingship shapes the king. This is why individual rulers are treated with such restraint in the earliest texts. They are named, their reigns are measured, their cities are recorded, but their personalities are largely absent. The texts do not dwell on their inner lives, their struggles, or their ambitions. They are vessels. Their significance lies in the role they occupy, not in who they are as individuals. This is especially striking in the antediluvian section of the king list. The first kings rule for impossibly long spans of time. Tens of thousands of years pass under a single reign. Modern readers often focus on the numbers, trying to rationalize them or dismiss them. But the more important detail is not how long these kings rule. It is the fact that their authority is never questioned. There is no mention of rebellion, no succession crisis, no competing claimants. Kingship moves smoothly from city to city, from ruler to ruler, as if guided by a logic beyond human interference. When kingship leaves one city and appears in another, the transition is stated without explanation. The text does not describe conquest or migration. It simply notes the transfer, as if kingship itself chooses where to reside. This reinforces the idea that authority is not anchored in land or bloodline alone. It is a force that can relocate, a condition that can shift without violence. The city does not become important because it gains kingship. Kingship becomes visible by settling in a city. This way of thinking removes human agency from the origin of political power. The king does not claim legitimacy by pointing to ancestors or victories. He rules because kingship has arrived. His task is to maintain alignment with that authority, not to justify it. The gods, in this framework, are not symbolic overseers of human politics. They are the source from which authority flows. But even here, the texts are careful. No single god invents kingship. It is not portrayed as the personal gift of a deity acting alone. Kingship belongs to the structure of the cosmos. The gods administer it. They do not originate it in isolation. This matters because it suggests that authority itself predates both humans and gods in their familiar forms. If kingship can descend, then it exists somewhere before it arrives. It belongs to a realm that is not bound to human time or human development. The texts never describe that realm in detail, they do not need to. Its existence is assumed. The practical consequences of this belief are visible in how kings behave. Sumerian kings are not free to rule as they please. Their power is conditional. They are expected to uphold justice, maintain temples, ensure proper ritual observance, and preserve order. When they fail, their legitimacy erodes, not because people withdraw consent, but because alignment with the descending authority is broken. This is why divine displeasure features so prominently in political narratives. Famine, invasion, and disaster are not framed as random events or purely human failures. They are signs that kingship has been mishandled. The authority itself remains intact, but the current holder is no longer worthy of it. In some cases, kingship departs entirely. The texts record moments when cities lose their status as centres of power. Again, there is no detailed explanation, no moral lesson spelled out. Kingship leaves. That is all. The implication is clear. Authority is not owned, it is borrowed. This worldview makes the idea of being the first civilization almost irrelevant. If kingship descends, then someone or something has already exercised authority before it reaches human society. Humans are recipients, not originators. Civilization is a stage upon which pre-existing structures become visible, not the place where those structures are created. The descent of kingship also aligns with the Sumerian treatment of time. In the earliest periods, when kings rule for tens of thousands of years, authority appears stable and uninterrupted. There is no urgency, no pressure to secure succession. The long reigns suggest a condition where order is deeply embedded, where disruption is minimal. After the flood, this changes. Reigns shorten dramatically. Kingship still descends, but it does so into a more fragile world. Transitions become more frequent. Cities rise and fall. Authority must be reaffirmed repeatedly through ritual and law. This is not presented as improvement. It is presented as necessity. The flood in this context does not create kingship. It constrains it. Authority continues, but under new conditions. Humans must work harder to maintain alignment. The distance between the source of authority and its human expression increases. What is never suggested is that kingship emerges from human agreement. There is no hint of social contract. No indication that people collectively decide to be ruled. The absence of such narratives is telling. It reflects a worldview in which order is imposed from outside human society, rather than negotiated within it. This does not mean that the Sumerians saw themselves as powerless. On the contrary, their texts emphasize responsibility. Kings are judged, cities are held accountable, but responsibility operates within a framework that is already established. Humans act inside a system they did not design. The language used to describe kingship reinforces this again and again. Verbs of descent, placement, and assignment dominate. Rarely do we see verbs of invention or creation attached to political structures. The king is installed. He is set upon the throne. He is called to rule. These phrases imply reception rather than initiative. Even rebellion, when it appears in later texts, does not challenge the concept of kingship itself. It challenges the current holder. The institution remains sacred. The problem lies in misalignment, not in authority as such. This distinction is critical when we consider the broader theme of successive civilizations. A civilization that believes its authority descends is unlikely to see itself as the first. It already understands itself as downstream. It recognizes that structures existed before humans were capable of articulating them. This perspective also explains why the Sumerians were so invested in ritual continuity. Ritual is not symbolic performance, it is maintenance. Through correct ritual action, the alignment between heaven and earth is preserved. Kings play a central role in this process, not as creators of order, but as its caretakers. When kings neglect ritual, disaster follows. When they honour it, stability returns. The cause and effect relationship is not moral in the modern sense. It is structural. Order must be upheld or it degrades. This structural understanding of authority leaves little room for innovation at the level of governance. Change occurs, but it is often portrayed as restoration rather than reform. Even new laws are framed as returns to proper order rather than departures from the past. All of this points to a civilization deeply aware of its own position within a longer sequence. The Sumerians did not imagine themselves standing at the dawn of order. They imagined themselves standing beneath it. Kingship that descends instead of emerging is not merely a political idea. It is a statement about the nature of reality. It says that systems precede actors. That structure comes before story. That civilization is not something humanity invents from nothing, but something that arrives, settles, and eventually moves on. As we continue, this descending authority will help us understand why the world the Sumerians describe feels already arranged when writing begins, why cities appear without origins, why knowledge feels inherited rather than discovered. Kingship is only one expression of a much broader pattern, one that becomes clearer when we look at how the world itself seems to be waiting, already prepared, long before humans begin to record their place within it. When writing appears in the Sumerian record, it does not arrive like a spark. It does not announce itself as a breakthrough or a turning point. There is no sense of experimentation, no visible struggle to learn how marks on clay might correspond to speech, memory, or authority. Writing simply enters the record already functioning, already standardized enough to carry contracts, hymns, inventories, legal decisions, and cosmological statements. It does not feel young, it feels settled. This is one of the quietest but most revealing details in the entire Sumerian legacy. Writing, one of the most transformative technologies humanity ever developed, does not appear in the texts as an invention in progress. It appears as infrastructure. It is already embedded in daily life, already trusted, already essential. The earliest tablets we possess are not tentative. They are confident. They track grain deliveries. They list workers. They assign rations. They name gods and cities without explanation. This implies something important. By the time writing becomes visible to us archaeologically, the world it serves is already organized enough to require it. You do not need writing to survive. You need it when survival has become complex, when resources must be managed across time, when authority must be recorded rather than remembered, when systems have grown larger than personal memory can reliably hold. Writing does not create organization. Organization creates the need for writing. In the Sumerian case, that organization is already in place. Cities are functioning economic units. Temples manage surplus. Labor is divided. Trade networks exist. Calendars regulate agricultural cycles. Law has structure. None of this is introduced. It is assumed. Writing arrives as a response to complexity, not as its origin. This matters deeply for how we understand the claim that the Sumerians were the first civilization. If writing appears only after a world is already organized, then the visible start of history is not the start of civilization. It is the point at which civilization has already reached a level of density that requires permanent records. The Sumerians themselves seem to understand this instinctively. They do not mythologize writing as a sudden gift that creates order out of chaos. Instead, writing is treated as one tool among many for maintaining an order that already exists. It records, it preserves, it stabilizes. Even when writing is associated with the gods, it is framed as transmission rather than creation. Knowledge is given, signs are taught, but the world that receives them is already structured enough to make use of them. Writing does not organize the world, it serves it. This becomes clearer when we look at what the earliest texts actually do. They do not tell stories, they manage reality, they count, they allocate, They define relationships. They formalize obligations. This is not the language of a society discovering how to govern itself. It is the language of a society already governed. The earliest narrative texts come later. Hymns, myths, epics. These are layered on top of an administrative foundation that is already stable. Writing begins as accounting, not storytelling. This sequence alone suggests that the social and economic systems precede the literary imagination, not the other way around. And those systems are not simple. They require coordination across seasons. They assume predictable cycles. They rely on established authority. A farmer delivering grain to a temple is participating in a system that depends on trust in weights, measures, calendars, and enforcement. None of this is explained because none of it is new. The same applies to religious structure. Temples appear fully formed in the written record. They have personnel, they have rituals, they have economic roles. Gods are associated with specific cities and functions without introduction. This implies a long period of development before writing captures it. If the Sumerians believed they were inventing civilization from scratch, we would expect the texts to linger on origins, on first harvests, on the founding of temples, on the moment when people learned to live together in cities. Instead, those moments are absent. The absence is not accidental. It reflects a worldview in which those developments belong to an earlier time, one that does not require retelling. The Sumerians write from inside civilization, not at its threshold. This inside position shapes everything. Writing is used to maintain continuity rather than to explore novelty. Scribes copy earlier texts meticulously, even when the language has become archaic. Accuracy matters more than understanding. Preservation takes priority over reinterpretation. This tells us something crucial about how the Sumerians viewed their place in time. They did not see themselves as founders. They saw themselves as custodians. Writing was a way to hold together what had already been assembled. The physical form of writing reinforces this attitude. Clay tablets are heavy, durable, designed to last. They are not ephemeral messages. They are objects meant to persist. When a text is impressed into clay and baked, it becomes part of the landscape of memory. It resists decay. This permanence suggests an anxiety about loss rather than a celebration of invention. Writing appears at the moment when the risk of forgetting becomes real, when the accumulation of knowledge has reached a point where oral transmission is no longer sufficient. That accumulation must have taken time, generations, perhaps many more than we can easily imagine. Writing is not the first step. It is a response to depth. Even the structure of the script itself supports this. Early Sumerian writing is already complex. It uses standardized signs. It distinguishes between categories. It encodes abstract concepts. This level of sophistication does not arise overnight. It implies prior experimentation that remains invisible to us. But more importantly, it implies a cultural environment capable of sustaining such experimentation. A world where specialists exist, where training is possible, where continuity across generations is expected. This again points backward. Writing appears at the surface of history, but its roots sink deeper. It grows out of a world already layered with experience. The Sumerians do not comment on this because to them it is normal. The world has always been organized. Writing simply becomes one more way to interact with that organization. This perspective also explains why later texts often speak with authority about distant times. Scribes record events long before their own lives with confidence. They list kings who ruled for impossible lengths of time without apology. They preserve genealogies that stretch beyond practical memory. This is not because they are naive. It is because they inherit a worldview in which deep time is real, even if its details are unclear. Writing allows them to anchor fragments of that depth, without pretending to fully understand it. The organized world that writing enters is not static. It is dynamic, but its dynamics follow established patterns. Floods occur. Cities rise and fall. Authority shifts, but the underlying framework persists. Writing helps manage these changes without challenging the framework itself. This is why writing does not challenge the idea of descending kingship. It reinforces it. Records formalize what has been given. They do not question its origin. The same applies to law. Laws are recorded because they already exist as expectations. Writing codifies them, but does not invent them. Justice is treated as something that can be violated, not something that must be created. This organized world also assumes boundaries between cities, between roles, between human and divine. Writing respects these boundaries. It names them. It does not attempt to redefine them. In this sense, writing is conservative. It stabilizes. It slows change. It anchors civilization to what has already been done. This is exactly what one would expect in a culture that sees itself as inheriting rather than originating. If we step back, a pattern becomes clear. Civilization does not begin with writing. Writing appears when civilization has already matured enough to fear its own fragility. The Sumerians lived in a world where order had been lost before. Flood stories are not abstract. They are memories of collapse. Writing becomes a defense against repetition, a way to preserve structure when conditions shift. This defensive quality gives writing a particular tone. It is precise. It is careful. It avoids unnecessary embellishment. Even literary texts are grounded in structure. They reinforce roles. They explain consequences. Nothing about early Sumerian writing suggests experimentation with identity or purpose. Those questions are already answered. Writing assumes a world that knows what it is. This assumption becomes even more striking when contrasted with later cultures that explicitly frame writing as a beginning. In those traditions, writing often arrives alongside claims of chosenness or novelty. In Sumer, it arrives quietly, like a clerk entering an office that has been running for a long time. This quiet arrival tells us more than any boast could. It suggests that by the time humans began to leave permanent marks behind, they were already standing on foundations laid by something earlier, something that had shaped cities, authority, religion, and labour before a single sign was pressed into clay. Writing does not announce the dawn of civilization. It marks the moment civilization becomes self-aware enough to record itself, and that awareness carries with it a sense of continuity rather than origin. The Sumerians do not write to say, "This is who we have just become." They write to say, "This is what must not be forgotten." As we move further, this already organised world will make the next shift easier to see. If writing appears late, if authority descends, if language favours continuation, then the civilizations implied before the Sumerians are not speculative. They are structural. They are embedded in how the Sumerians understood reality itself. What comes next is not the appearance of order, but the recognition that even within an organised world, there are layers still deeper, older frameworks that writing can record but never fully recover, remnants of worlds that functioned before the need to explain them ever arose. The earliest civilization implied in the Sumerian texts is the hardest to see precisely because it leaves no direct trace. It does not appear as a named culture. It has no kings, no cities, no recorded institutions. It exists only as an assumption embedded in language, structure, and silence. This is the first civilization not because it is labelled as such, but because everything else seems to rest on top of it. This is the point where modern readers often become uncomfortable. We are accustomed to evidence that can be pointed to, dated, excavated and classified. We expect foundations to leave ruins. But the Sumerian record suggests something older than architecture, older than kingship, older even than the familiar gods. It suggests a condition of order that predates narrative itself. This first civilization is not described because description itself may not yet apply. The texts speak of a time when existence is already structured but not yet personalized, before named gods take on roles, before heaven and earth are separated, before labour, kingship or humanity require explanation. This is not chaos, it is coherence without story. In the earliest cosmological passages, there is no struggle to impose order. There is no conflict between forces vying for dominance. There is simply existence in a stable state. Water exists. Space exists. Potential exists. The world is not being assembled. It is waiting. What makes this significant is that the Sumerians do not frame this state as primitive. They do not suggest it is inferior or incomplete. They do not portray it as a problem that needs solving. It is simply prior, earlier, different in kind. This implies a form of civilization that does not resemble ours at all. Not urban, not political, not dependent on hierarchy. Instead, it is systemic, a condition in which order is inherent rather than enforced. There is no need for law because there is no violation, no need for kings because there is no competition, no need for ritual because there is no separation. This first civilization exists only as memory because it cannot be re-entered. Once differentiation begins, once roles are assigned, once time starts to stretch and compress, that original condition is gone. It cannot be rebuilt. It can only be remembered indirectly, through the shape of what follows. The Sumerians hint at this memory by what they do not say. They never describe a moment when order is imposed on chaos. Instead, they describe moments when order changes form. Heaven and earth are separated, but they already exist. Gods are born, but the world they enter is already functional. Humans are created, but the cosmos they inhabit is already governed. This pattern implies that the earliest condition was not disordered. It was undivided, and division, while necessary for life as we know it, is also the beginning of loss. The memory of this first civilization survives as nostalgia without imagery. It is not romanticized. It is not idealized through stories of golden cities or perfect beings. Instead, it lingers as a sense that something fundamental has already passed out of reach. This is why later texts struggle with beginnings. They circle them but never land. They describe transitions but not origins. The first civilization cannot be narrated because narration itself belongs to a later stage. In this earliest condition, time does not behave as it later will. There are no reigns to measure, no lifespans to count, no generations to list. Time is present, but it does not yet dominate experience. It does not yet press forward with urgency. It simply holds. The Sumerians hint at this timelessness when they describe the earliest state as one where names have not yet been fixed. Naming is power. Naming creates boundaries. Before names, there is relation without division. This unnamed world is stable precisely because it has not been categorized. Memory of this state is preserved not through story, but through structure. Later systems echo it faintly. The idea that kingship descends. The idea that authority exists before humans. The idea that law reflects cosmic order rather than social agreement. All of these are residues of an earlier condition where order was not negotiated. This first civilization is therefore not a culture in the usual sense. It is a condition of existence, one that later civilizations can approach, but never fully replicate. Each subsequent stage adds complexity, and with complexity comes fragility. The Sumerians do not attempt to return to this state. They do not advocate for it. They do not imagine it as a future goal. It is irretrievable. It belongs to the deep past before separation, before memory required preservation. This is why it exists only as memory, and even that memory is diffuse. It is not remembered through images or events. It is remembered through absence, through the sense that something simpler and more stable once existed. As we move forward into later stages, this first civilization will recede further into the background, but it will continue to shape everything that follows. Each new structure will carry traces of it. Each loss will echo its disappearance. The Sumerians did not need to explain this first civilization. They lived downstream from it. They felt its absence more than its presence. and that absence becomes the quiet foundation upon which all later worlds are built, including their own. From here, differentiation accelerates. Order becomes assigned rather than inherent. Roles emerge. Authority takes form. The second condition appears, one where structure is still intact, but separation has begun, and with separation comes the first hint that stability may no longer be permanent. The second world implied in the Sumerian text is easier to recognize than the first, but it is still not described in the way modern histories describe an age. It has no name. It is not introduced. It is simply there, already functioning, already ordered, and entirely uninterested in explaining itself. If the first condition is remembered as undivided coherence, this second condition is remembered as structure that exists without justification. This is the stage where differentiation has begun, but explanation has not yet followed. Heaven and earth are present as distinct realities. Space has meaning. Boundaries exist. Yet nowhere do the texts pause to tell us why these boundaries exist, or how they came to be accepted. They are treated as facts, not achievements. This is a crucial shift. Order is no longer inherent in sameness, as it was in the first condition. It now depends on arrangement. Things occupy places. Forces have domains. The cosmos is organized, but not yet narrated. It functions, but it does not speak about itself. The Sumerian scribes reflect this condition by how they write. They describe the world as layered without describing the process that produced those layers. The sky is above, the earth is below, waters exist beneath and beyond. These are not metaphors, they are coordinates. The texts assume that anyone listening already accepts this structure as self-evident. There is no curiosity expressed about why the sky is above rather than below. No philosophical inquiry into why order takes this form rather than another. The world simply is the way it is. Explanation is unnecessary because challenge has not yet arisen. This second world is marked by clarity without commentary. Everything has a place, but no one feels compelled to explain how those places were assigned. This is not ignorance. It is confidence. The kind of confidence that only exists when order is stable enough to be taken for granted. In this condition, authority does not yet require enforcement. There is no need for kingship, law, or punishment as later texts will describe them. Not because authority is absent, but because it is unquestioned. Order does not need to assert itself when nothing resists it. The Sumerians hint at this stage whenever they describe a time before labour becomes burdensome, before the gods complain, before humans are created to relieve divine work. These details matter. They suggest a world in which effort exists but friction does not. Work is part of existence, not a problem to be solved. This world is not idle, it is active. But its activity does not generate tension. There is no narrative of struggle because there is nothing pushing against the structure. Everything moves according to expectation. This is why explanation is absent. Explanation emerges when order is threatened, misunderstood, or contested. In the second world, none of that has happened yet. Structure holds without resistance. The language used in the text reflects this. Verbs describe states rather than actions. Things are established, set, placed. These words do not describe events in time so much as conditions in space. The emphasis is on arrangement, not on change. When change does occur, it is described as adjustment rather than disruption. Separation happens, but it is not violent. Heaven and earth part, but there is no catastrophe. There is no lament. There is no sense that something has gone wrong. It is simply the way things proceed. This calm acceptance suggests that the second world is experienced as natural, not in the sense of wilderness, but in the sense of inevitability. Order feels like the default state of reality. This is also the stage where gods begin to appear as recognizable entities, but not yet as personalities. They are associated with domains rather than stories. Sky, earth, water, air. These are functions before they are characters. The divine is present as principle rather than drama. The Sumerians do not describe these beings arguing, competing, or negotiating at this stage. Those behaviours belong to later worlds. Here, the divine realm mirrors the structure of the cosmos. Each force occupies its place without conflict. This absence of conflict is important. Conflict generates narrative. Narrative generates explanation. The lack of both suggests a world that does not yet require interpretation. The second world is therefore not primitive. It is efficient. It does not waste energy on justification. It does not reflect on itself. It simply operates. This kind of order is fragile in a way that is not immediately visible. Because it does not explain itself, it cannot defend itself once conditions change. Its stability depends entirely on continuity. Once something interrupts that continuity, explanation becomes necessary, and the world moves into a different condition. The Sumerians hint at this vulnerability indirectly. They do not describe the end of the second world. They move past it. The shift is subtle. Suddenly, separation is no longer enough. Roles must be assigned. Responsibilities emerge. Labour becomes uneven. Some beings command while others work. This is the beginning of hierarchy. And hierarchy introduces imbalance. With imbalance comes tension. With tension comes the need for narrative. But before that shift, the second world stands as a model of order without commentary. A condition where everything is aligned well enough that no one asks why. This is why it is remembered so faintly. Memory tends to preserve disruption, not stability. Catastrophes are remembered. Transitions are recorded. Periods of seamless functioning leave little trace. The Sumerians do not describe this world because from their perspective, it had already passed too far into the background of existence to be named. It survives only as an assumption that order once existed without the need for enforcement. Traces of this assumption appear later in ritual language. Certain actions are performed because they are proper, not because they are effective. Properness itself becomes a value. This reflects an inherited memory of a time when alignment was automatic. The idea that there is a correct way for things to be, independent of human preference, comes from this stage. Order is not negotiated, it is recognized. This recognition shapes everything that follows. Even when conflict emerges, even when gods argue and humans suffer, there remains an underlying belief that order itself is real and recoverable. That belief originates here, in the second world. The Sumerians never suggest that chaos is the natural state of reality. Chaos appears only when order is disturbed. The baseline assumption is always structure. That assumption would not exist if the earliest memory were of disorder. This second condition therefore represents a critical step. It is the moment when the world becomes arranged but not yet contested, where structure exists but authority has not yet hardened into hierarchy, where explanation is unnecessary because experience confirms expectation. As we move further, this quiet stability will begin to fracture. The introduction of labour imbalance will create resentment. Roles will solidify. Authority will need justification. The divine realm will develop personality and conflict. But all of that rests on this earlier world, where order existed so completely that it did not require a voice. This is the second civilization not because it built cities or ruled land, but because it established a pattern of arrangement that everything else inherits. It is civilization as structure, not as culture. And once that structure exists, it becomes possible for later worlds to build upon it, to argue within it, to strain against it, and eventually to damage it. The silence of this second world is therefore not emptiness. It is the calm before complexity, the condition that makes all later developments possible, and the standard against which loss will eventually be measured as the story continues forward. The Third Age does not announce itself as a new beginning. It does not arrive with a proclamation or a boundary marked in the text. Instead, it hides in plain sight, woven into lists of names, relationships and descent. It is embedded in genealogy, not narrative. To recognize it, one has to stop reading divine family lines as mythology in the modern sense and start reading them as structure. In the Sumerian worldview, genealogy is not decorative, it is explanatory. To say that one god is the child of another is not simply to tell a story about birth, it is to describe succession, dependency, and the transfer of authority. Genealogy is how continuity is mapped when direct memory is no longer accessible. The third age emerges at the moment when the world requires administrators. In the earlier conditions, order exists without explanation, and structure holds without visible enforcement. But something shifts. The world becomes differentiated enough that maintenance is required. Forces no longer simply occupy their places, they must act within them. This is where genealogy begins to matter. The Sumerian texts begin to populate the cosmos with named beings whose roles are defined not by invention, but by inheritance. Sky gives rise to air. Earth produces growth. Water generates wisdom. These are not metaphors layered onto nature after the fact. They are explanations of how order sustains itself once it can no longer rely on inherent alignment alone. This is the third age. Not the age of humans, and not yet the age of kings, but the age in which responsibility enters existence. The divine genealogies record this transition quietly. They do not say, "Now the world changes." They simply begin listing relationships that did not need to be listed before. Parents appear, offspring are named, domains are assigned. The cosmos becomes populated not just with structure, but with roles. What matters here is that these gods are not creators in the absolute sense. They do not bring the universe into existence. They arrive into it. They are born into an already functioning world and take on specific tasks within it. This is fundamentally different from later ideas of omnipotent creator gods. In the Sumerian record, even the most powerful deities are constrained by what came before them. They inherit conditions they did not choose. Their authority is real, but it is delegated. This delegation is the defining feature of the Third Age. The cosmos now requires management. Rivers must flow correctly. Seasons must follow their courses. Fertility must be regulated. Boundaries must be maintained. These tasks are no longer automatic. They require oversight. The divine genealogies reflect this need by organizing power along lines of descent. Authority flows downward, not outward. Each generation of gods is more specialized than the last. Earlier beings embody broad principles. Later ones oversee narrower domains. This narrowing is not progress. It is adaptation. The Sumerians do not celebrate this shift. They record it. The movement from undivided order to administered order is treated as necessary, not ideal. It suggests that the earlier stability can no longer be sustained without intervention. The presence of divine genealogy itself is evidence of loss. When something must be inherited, it means it is no longer self-sustaining. This is why the genealogies feel dense and repetitive. They are doing structural work. They preserve the memory of how order is passed on when it can no longer exist on its own. The Third Age is therefore not a golden age. It is a transitional one. It exists between seamless order and overt hierarchy. Authority exists, but it has not yet hardened into domination. Responsibility exists, but it has not yet become burden. This balance is fragile. The gods of this age are not distant. They are involved, but they are not yet in conflict with one another. Their roles interlock. Each domain depends on others functioning properly. The system holds, but only because every part remains aligned. This interdependence is another marker of the Third Age. Earlier conditions do not require cooperation because they are unified. Later conditions require negotiation because they are fragmented. This stage requires coordination. The Sumerians encode this coordination through family relationships. A god's authority is inseparable from their lineage. To know who someone is descended from is to know what they are responsible for. This is why genealogies are preserved so carefully. They are maps of obligation. As time passes, these genealogies grow longer. More gods appear, more roles are defined. This is not because the Sumerians are inventing deities. It is because the world they experience requires more explanation. Complexity increases. With complexity comes specialization. With specialization comes hierarchy. The Third Age sits at the threshold of that process. It is also the last stage in which the divine order appears largely stable. Later texts will describe disputes, rivalries, and rebellion. Here those tensions are absent or muted. Authority flows smoothly from one level to another. This smoothness suggests that the system is still new. It has not yet been tested by strain. Another key feature of this age is the absence of humanity as a problem. Humans either do not yet exist in any meaningful sense, or they exist without causing disruption. The texts do not describe divine irritation, labour crises, or overpopulation. Those concerns belong to later stages. This tells us something important. The Third Age is not defined by human-centred civilization. It is defined by cosmic administration. This is why it is hidden from modern readers. We tend to look for ourselves in history. We search for moments where humans appear, act, and struggle. This age does not centre humanity. It centres maintenance. The Sumerians preserve it not because it is dramatic, but because it explains why later authority works the way it does. Kingship mirrors divine hierarchy. Law mirrors cosmic order. Responsibility flows downward. The memory of this age survives in assumptions. That authority is inherited. That order must be maintained. That failure to fulfill one's role has consequences beyond the individual. These assumptions are not argued. They are inherited. This Third Age also introduces a crucial idea that will echo forward through every later civilization. The idea that order is not permanent unless it is actively upheld. This is a profound shift from the earlier conditions. Stability is no longer guaranteed, it must be managed. And management introduces the possibility of failure. Once failure becomes possible, history begins to take on tension. The Sumerians do not dramatize this moment. They allow it to remain implicit. But the evidence is there in how their pantheon grows, how roles multiply, how responsibility becomes layered. This is the age where the seeds of later collapse are planted, not because of error, but because complexity itself carries risk. The Third Age is therefore not remembered as an era of splendour or catastrophe. It is remembered as a framework, a system that worked, but only as long as alignment held. As the story continues, that alignment will begin to strain. Labour will become uneven. Some beings will work while others command. Resentment will appear. Authority will harden. But none of that can happen without this stage first. The divine genealogies are not myths meant to entertain. They are records of transition. They show us a world moving from inherent order toward administered order, from unity toward hierarchy. The Sumerians did not label this as an age. They did not need to. They lived in its aftermath. They inherited a cosmos already shaped by it, and that inheritance explains why later worlds feel more fragile, more contested, and more prone to collapse. Once order must be passed down, it can also be mishandled. The Third Age is the moment that possibility enters existence. It is hidden not because it is unimportant, but because it worked too well for too long to demand explanation. Only when its balance begins to fail does the record start to speak more loudly. What follows is not immediate collapse, but gradual strain. Authority will become concentrated. Time will stretch unnaturally. Human rulers will begin to mirror divine ones. The next condition emerges not as a rupture, but as an intensification. Power lengthens. Reigns become vast. Memory expands beyond human scale. And with that expansion, the fourth civilization takes shape, one measured not by structure alone, but by time itself bending in ways that no longer resemble the world we recognize. The fourth civilization implied in the Sumerian record is the one that most often draws attention, not because it is the most clearly described, but because it distorts time so completely that it resists ordinary understanding. This is the age measured in reigns that last tens of thousands of years, an era where duration itself behaves differently, stretching far beyond anything later humanity would experience. Modern readers tend to fixate on the numbers, either trying to rationalize them away or dismiss them outright, but the numbers are not the point, they are signals. This is the first condition in which time becomes the defining feature of civilization. In earlier stages, order existed without explanation, then with structure, then with administration. In this fourth condition, continuity becomes so extended that it reshapes how authority, memory and existence itself are understood. Time no longer moves at a human pace. It becomes vast, slow, almost geological. And within that vastness, civilization does not feel temporary. It feels permanent. The Sumerian king list preserves this condition more clearly than any other source. It opens calmly, without emphasis, by listing rulers who govern for periods that dwarf all later history combined. These are not isolated exaggerations. They form a consistent pattern. King after king rules for thousands or tens of thousands of years. The list does not apologize, it does not explain, it does not qualify, it simply records. This calm presentation is crucial. The scribes who copied these lists centuries later did not see these numbers as absurd. They saw them as appropriate to a different order of existence. The numbers are not there to impress, they are there to mark difference. This fourth civilization is not defined by technology or culture as we usually understand those terms. It is defined by endurance. Authority persists long enough to outlast generations, outlast memory, outlast the need for renewal. Kingship does not cycle, it settles. In such a world, urgency does not exist in the same way. Decisions are not made with the pressure of succession or mortality. A ruler who reigns for tens of thousands of years does not govern toward an end. He governs as if the present condition will continue indefinitely. This changes everything. When time stretches this far, conflict loses its familiar shape. Rebellion becomes almost inconceivable. Innovation loses its appeal. There is no need to hurry, no need to adapt quickly, no need to reinvent systems that already function. The Sumerian texts reflect this by what they do not include. There are no detailed stories of political struggle in this age. No dynastic conflicts, no narratives of rise and fall. Kings simply rule, and then, eventually, kingship moves on. Even that movement is understated. When kingship shifts from one city to another, it is noted without drama. There is no conquest described, no disaster, no explanation. Kingship leaves one place and appears in another, as if time itself has decided that the centre of endurance must relocate. This suggests that the fourth civilization is not bound tightly to geography. Cities matter, but they are not permanent anchors. Authority is more stable than any physical location. This is an important clue. In later civilizations, cities rise and fall rapidly by comparison. Geography becomes decisive. Resources, trade routes, defences, all shape political life. In this earlier condition, endurance seems detached from those concerns. Something else sustains it. The most striking feature of this age is not simply long life, but stable life. Time does not merely stretch, it holds. The Sumerians do not describe this as a paradise, but neither do they describe it as harsh. There are no complaints about labour, no accounts of divine frustration, no stories of humanity becoming a problem. That silence matters. It suggests that the balance established in the Third Age is still holding here, but now amplified by duration. Administration works. Roles are fulfilled. Authority is accepted. There is no need for intervention. This is why humanity, if present at all, remains largely invisible in the record during this period. Humans do not yet strain the system. They do not multiply beyond control. They do not disturb the order. The fourth civilization is therefore not human-centered, it is system-centered. Time itself becomes the stabilizing force. When modern readers try to reinterpret the long reign symbolically, they often miss this structural point. Whether the numbers are literal, symbolic, or encoded matters less than what they convey. They tell us that the Sumerians believed there was a time when continuity extended far beyond human scale. This belief did not arise randomly. It reflects memory of a condition where mortality was not yet the defining feature of existence, where the boundary between divine and mortal was thinner, where authority flowed so directly from cosmic order that it did not need frequent renewal. The king list reinforces this by how abruptly this condition ends. After listing the antediluvian rulers and their immense reigns, the text does not transition gently. It states that the flood swept over the land. Then, suddenly, reigns become short. Lifespans collapse. Kingship continues, but under radically different conditions. The contrast is stark, and it is intentional. The flood is not simply a catastrophe, it is a temporal reset. It marks the end of the age where time itself was expansive. This implies that the fourth civilization existed under rules that no longer apply afterward. The Sumerians never say what those rules were. They do not describe the mechanism, they simply record the outcome. After the flood, the world no longer allows such duration. This loss of time is treated as permanent. Later kings never regain those immense reigns. No ritual restores them. No divine favour reverses the change. Time itself has been altered. This suggests that the fourth civilization is not just earlier, it is categorically different. The Sumerians preserve its memory carefully but without nostalgia. They do not suggest it can return. They do not frame it as a goal. It belongs to the past in a way that cannot be undone. This acceptance is revealing. It suggests that the Sumerians understood history not as a straight line of improvement, but as a sequence of conditions, each with its own limits. The fourth condition allowed for impossible time. The fifth will not. Another subtle feature of this age is how identity functions. When a king rules for tens of thousands of years, identity becomes fused with role. There is no meaningful distinction between the office and the individual. The king is kingship. This fusion explains why personalities remain absent. Character does not matter when role dominates. Individual variation becomes irrelevant over such spans. This is also why genealogy becomes less important during this stage. Succession is rare. Continuity is personal rather than familial. Authority does not need to be transferred often enough to generate anxiety about lineage. That will change later, when reigns shorten and succession becomes frequent. But here, genealogy recedes into the background. Duration replaces descent as the marker of legitimacy. This again suggests that the fourth civilization is stable not because of control, but because of alignment. The system does not require constant adjustment. The Sumerians hint at this alignment through their treatment of labour. In later texts, gods complain about work. They seek relief. They create humans to take over burdensome tasks. None of that appears here. The absence of complaint implies balance. Work exists, but it is not oppressive. Roles are fulfilled without friction. This is not utopia. It is an equilibrium. Equilibrium is fragile, but not immediately. It can persist for a long time until something shifts beyond tolerance. The Sumerians never specify what causes the end of this age. They do not describe moral failure or corruption. The flood arrives, but its deeper cause remains ambiguous. This ambiguity is important. It suggests that the end of the fourth civilization is not framed as punishment. It is framed as inevitability. Conditions change. The world moves on. The flood functions as a boundary rather than a judgment. It separates eras with different rules. After this boundary, time collapses. Human life becomes short. Authority fragments. Memory becomes something that must be preserved deliberately rather than lived continuously. This makes the fourth civilization appear in retrospect as a plateau, a long stretch of stability before decline, but the Sumerians do not mourn it, they record it. This restraint tells us something about their worldview. They did not see history as tragic loss or triumphant ascent, they saw it as transformation. The fourth civilization is remembered because it sets a baseline. It shows what is possible under different conditions. It explains why later life feels constrained. Without this memory, later limitations would feel arbitrary. With it, they feel contextual. The impossible time of the Fourth Age explains why later humans are so focused on preservation. When you know that time once behaved differently, its current limits feel imposed rather than natural. This knowledge shapes everything that follows. It informs ritual. It informs kingship. It informs the sense that something fundamental has been taken away. The Sumerians do not say this explicitly. They do not need to. It is embedded in the contrast. This is why the fourth civilization remains one of the most important implied stages. It anchors the sequence. It shows that civilization can exist in forms radically different from the one we inhabit. It also prepares us for what comes next. After such vast endurance, collapse does not come as violent chaos, but as contraction. The next world will not disappear in fire or destruction. It will fade, it will shorten, it will lose coherence gradually. The fifth condition emerges not as a new beginning, but as an aftermath. A world still organized, still inhabited, but no longer capable of sustaining the impossible time that once defined existence. And in that shortening, in that quiet loss of duration, we begin to see a different kind of civilization take shape. One marked not by how long it lasts, but by how it ends without ever being fully described. The fifth world is the most elusive of all because it does not end in spectacle. There is no detailed account of its collapse, no narrative of destruction carefully preserved in story or hymn. Instead, it fades. It recedes from the record without explanation, leaving behind only subtle changes in how time, authority, and memory behave. Its disappearance is not marked by chaos, but by silence. This is deeply unsettling to modern expectations. We assume that endings must be dramatic to be meaningful. We look for fires, floods, wars, or divine judgments. The Sumerian texts offer none of this for the fifth condition. What they give instead is absence, and that absence tells us more than any catastrophe could. In the earlier age, the fourth civilization, time itself was expansive. Authority persisted for tens of thousands of years. Continuity felt unbreakable. The fifth world inherits that structure but not its endurance. Something fundamental has shifted, yet no one explains what it is. The world continues to function, but it no longer stretches indefinitely forward. It begins to wear. This is the age where limits quietly reassert themselves. Kings still rule. Cities still exist. Rituals are still performed. But the sense of permanence that once defined existence is gone. Reigns shorten, not abruptly, but enough to be noticeable. Succession becomes more frequent. Memory must be maintained rather than lived. What is striking is how little attention the texts draw to this change. There is no commentary on loss, no lament for diminished time. The scribes simply record what is now true. This restraint suggests that the shift was accepted as irreversible. The fifth world is not portrayed as broken, it is portrayed as altered. This alteration shows itself most clearly in how continuity is handled. In earlier conditions, continuity was embodied. Authority remained with a single ruler for immense spans. In this fifth stage, continuity must be managed. It passes from one figure to another. Lineage begins to matter again. Genealogies become more prominent, not because ancestry has suddenly become important, but because authority can no longer rely on duration alone. When reigns shorten, legitimacy must be reaffirmed through descent. This marks a quiet but profound change. Authority is no longer self-sustaining, it must be reinforced. The Sumerians do not dramatize this shift because from their perspective, it is not a moral failure, it is a condition of the world. The rules have changed, and life adjusts accordingly. This is also the stage where explanation begins to creep back into the record, though still indirectly. Myths grow slightly more elaborate. Relationships between gods become more detailed. Roles are clarified. The need to explain increases because the system no longer holds effortlessly. Yet even here, the end of the fifth world is not described. There is no moment where the text says, and then it was over. Instead, the characteristics that defined it simply stop appearing. This absence suggests that the fifth civilization did not collapse through sudden violence. It dissolved through transition. One condition gave way to another without a clear boundary. This is why it is so difficult to isolate. The fifth world is neither the age of impossible time nor the age that ends in flood. It sits between them, borrowing elements from both, yet fully belonging to neither. Time is no longer infinite, but it is not yet fragile. Authority still feels stable, but it is no longer absolute. The divine remains involved, but its presence feels less immediate. This in-between quality is why the end of this world leaves no scar. It is not destroyed, it is superseded. The Sumerian record preserves many transitions like this, shifts that occur not because something fails catastrophically, but because conditions gradually become incompatible with what existed before. In this sense, the fifth world ends the way many systems do in reality. It becomes obsolete. The lack of description is therefore appropriate. There is no single event to describe, no decisive moment. The world simply ceases to be the primary condition of existence. Its functions are absorbed into what follows, its structures are repurposed, its memory thins. This thinning is visible in the way later texts struggle to distinguish earlier periods. Names blur, timelines compress, distinctions that once mattered become vague. This is not because scribes forgot. It is because the world they inherited no longer supported those distinctions. The fifth civilization becomes background. Its defining features dissolve into assumption. One of the clearest signs of this dissolution is how labour begins to change. In earlier conditions, work exists without complaint. In later ones, labour becomes a problem. In the fifth world, we begin to see the seeds of that tension. The gods still oversee the cosmos, but the distribution of effort becomes uneven. Some beings carry burdens that others do not. The system still functions, but strain is visible. This strain does not yet result in open conflict. That belongs to the next stage. Here, it remains latent. A pressure building beneath the surface. This is another reason the end of the fifth world is not described. The conditions that end it are not dramatic enough to narrate. They are structural. The Sumerians are keen observers of structure. They notice when balance shifts. They record the consequences. They do not invent stories to fill the gaps. The transition out of the fifth world prepares the ground for something far more disruptive. A world where imbalance can no longer be absorbed quietly, where tension erupts into decision, where intervention becomes necessary. But before that happens, the fifth world fades, leaving behind only traces in how the sixth world must operate. Those traces appear as caution, as rules, as limits imposed where none existed before. The Sumerians do not treat this as tragedy. They treat it as context. Civilization, in their view, is not guaranteed to persist in a single form. It adapts, contracts, and reorganizes. Some worlds end not because they are destroyed, but because they are no longer sustainable. This understanding carries forward into how the flood is later described. The flood is not the first time the world changes. It is simply the most dramatic boundary. The fifth world teaches that not all endings announce themselves. Some simply stop being referenced. This has implications for how we read the entire sequence. If one world can end without description, then absence in the record does not equal non-existence. It may indicate a transition too gradual to dramatize. This is why the idea of multiple civilizations is embedded rather than stated. The Sumerians did not need to number them. They lived with the consequences of succession. The fifth civilization exists as a fading imprint. It bridges a world of immense duration and a world of crisis. It absorbs the shock of change so that what follows does not arrive into total chaos. In doing so, it performs an essential function. It allows continuity to persist even as conditions deteriorate. But that continuity is not infinite. As the pressure within the system increases, as labour becomes burdensome, and authority struggles to maintain balance, the stage is set for a decisive rupture. One that cannot be absorbed quietly. The next world will not fade. It will be interrupted. And that interruption, unlike the quiet ending of the fifth civilization, will be marked clearly, deliberately, and repeatedly. Not because it begins something new, but because it draws a hard line between what the world was allowed to be before and what it must become afterward. The sixth civilization is the one we recognize most easily, not because it is well described, but because it is compressed. It survives not as lived memory or continuous structure, but as residue, names, numbers, lists, fragments arranged carefully, almost defensively, as if the act of recording itself were an attempt to prevent total erasure. This is the world that exists immediately before the flood, but it is already diminished before the waters arrive. Unlike the earlier conditions, this civilization is no longer defined by seamless order, vast time or quiet stability. It is defined by record keeping, by enumeration, by the need to fix memory into durable form because memory itself can no longer be trusted to endure. The clearest expression of this reduction appears in the Sumerian king list. Where earlier ages flow slowly, this one is catalogued. Cities are named, kings are listed, reign lengths are given with precision. The language becomes tight, factual, almost austere. This is not because scribes suddenly became less imaginative. It is because imagination is no longer sufficient to hold the past together. What remains must be counted. The sixth civilization is remembered not through stories but through accounting. The kings of this world are no longer semi-eternal figures ruling across immeasurable spans. Their reigns are still long by later standards, but they are finite. Tens of thousands of years give way to thousands, then to hundreds. Time is collapsing, and the record reflects that compression. Authority still descends, kingship still moves from city to city. But now those movements feel more deliberate, more constrained. The system still operates, but it is no longer effortless. This is where genealogy, chronology, and geography converge. Each king is anchored to a city. Each city belongs to a sequence. Continuity depends on orderliness. Disorder threatens memory itself. The Sumerians preserve this period obsessively because it sits at the edge of loss. It is the last civilization that still remembers the world before rupture, even if that memory has already thinned. This thinning shows up everywhere. Cities are no longer described as eternal centres. They are waypoints. Kingship does not settle permanently. It passes through. The implication is subtle but powerful. Civilization no longer feels anchored. It feels temporary. This is also the stage where human presence becomes unmistakable. Humans are no longer invisible participants in a cosmic system. They are active, numerous, loud, productive. The world fills with activity. For the first time, this activity becomes a problem. The gods begin to react not to disorder but to excess. Humanity multiplies. Cities grow dense. Labour increases. Noise fills the world. This is not framed as moral failure. It is framed as saturation. The system that once absorbed activity without strain can no longer do so. This is why the sixth civilization is reduced to names and numbers. It exists at the threshold where qualitative description gives way to quantitative necessity. There is too much to remember, too much happening, too little stability to rely on assumption. The scribes respond by listing. Lists are a defensive form of memory. They do not interpret, they do not embellish. They preserve the bare minimum required to acknowledge existence. By listing kings and reigns, the Sumerians are not celebrating authority. They are bracketing it, containing it within limits. This containment reflects a deeper anxiety, the sense that time itself is no longer reliable, that continuity must be enforced through documentation. The sixth world is therefore hyper-aware of succession. Every reign ends, every king is followed. The inevitability of transition becomes unavoidable. This awareness is entirely absent from the Fourth Age. There, succession is irrelevant. Here, it is central. The Sumerians do not comment on this change. They let the structure of the text speak for itself. The shift from vast narrative absence to tight enumeration is itself the message. Another sign of reduction is how myth and history begin to blur. Stories that once belonged to cosmic time now sit alongside administrative records. The distinction between sacred narrative and political record weakens. This blending suggests that the world no longer has room for separate modes of understanding. Everything is pulled toward immediacy. The sixth civilization lives close to crisis, even before the crisis arrives. This proximity shapes how gods behave. They are no longer distant administrators. They are reactive. They complain. They debate. They intervene. The famous motif of divine dissatisfaction appears here for the first time in a sustained way. The gods are disturbed. They are restless. They are no longer content to simply oversee. This marks a profound change. Divine frustration implies that the system is no longer balanced. Oversight has become labour. This labour imbalance mirrors what is happening among humans. Work becomes heavy. Organisation becomes difficult. Maintenance becomes constant. The system strains under its own success. The Sumerians preserve this strain indirectly. They do not describe social collapse. They describe overactivity, overpopulation, noise. Noise is an important word here. It is not chaos. It is not violence. It is excess presence. The sixth civilization does not fail because it is disordered. It fails because it is too ordered, too populated, too active for the conditions it inherited. This is why the flood, when it arrives, is framed not as a correction of evil, but as a reduction of volume, a return to quiet. The gods are not offended. They are overwhelmed. This framing makes the reduction of the sixth world feel tragic in a very specific way. It is not punished, it is curtailed. Before the flood, the sixth civilization already feels compressed. Time is short, space is crowded, authority is stretched thin. The lists reflect this pressure. They rush toward an endpoint. The rhythm accelerates, and then the record stops describing succession and starts describing boundary. The flood does not erase the sixth civilization's memory entirely. It freezes it. What remains are those names and numbers, preserved precisely because everything else is lost. This is why the sixth world feels so stark in the record. It is the last civilization before rupture, and it knows it, even if it cannot articulate it. The Sumerians do not frame this awareness consciously, but the structure of their text betrays it. Enumeration replaces narration. Precision replaces expansiveness. Memory has become something that must be defended. The sixth civilization is therefore not merely the one before the flood. It is the civilization that realizes, perhaps unconsciously, that continuity is no longer guaranteed. This realization shapes how the flood itself is treated. The flood is not just an event, it is a delimiter, a line drawn across time. Everything before it belongs to a different order of existence. Everything after it will operate under new constraints. The sixth world stands at that line. It is the last to remember the earlier conditions, even dimly. It is the last to preserve names stretching back toward impossible time. After it, the world becomes smaller. But before we cross that boundary, one detail matters deeply. The Sumerians never describe the sixth civilization as failed. They do not accuse it of corruption. They do not portray it as doomed by its own actions. They treat it as complete. It lived. It functioned. It reached a point where its own density required reduction. That reduction comes next. And unlike the fading end of the Fifth World, this transition will be unmistakable, not because it creates something new, but because it marks once and for all the difference between worlds that could exist under older rules and the one humanity is allowed to inhabit afterward. The flood does not begin civilization. It closes the door on six that came before, and with that closure the seventh world begins not as a triumph, but as an inheritance shaped by loss. The flood occupies a strange position in the Sumerian record. It is described repeatedly, preserved across multiple versions, and treated as unquestionably real within the logic of the texts. Yet despite its scale and finality, it is never treated as a beginning. It does not mark the creation of the world, the invention of civilization, or the first appearance of humanity. Instead, it functions as a line drawn through time, separating conditions rather than initiating them. This distinction is easy to miss because later traditions reinterpret the flood as an origin point. In those retellings, the world is reborn, history restarts, and everything that follows is framed as new. The Sumerian texts do not do this. They are remarkably consistent in their refusal to treat the flood as a fresh start. What follows the flood is constrained, diminished, and altered, not renewed. The language used before and after the flood makes this clear. Before the flood, time behaves expansively. Reigns stretch far beyond human scale. Authority flows with little interruption. The boundary between divine and mortal remains thin. After the flood, all of this changes at once. Lifespans shorten dramatically. Kingship becomes unstable. Human labour becomes central. The gods withdraw from daily presence. These changes are not framed as improvements. They are not celebrated. They are simply stated as facts. The world after the flood is not better. It is smaller. This is why the flood functions as a boundary rather than an origin. It divides two modes of existence that cannot overlap. The rules that governed the earlier worlds no longer apply. The flood does not create a new order so much as enforce new limits. The Sumerians never suggest that humanity begins after the flood. Humans already exist long before it. Cities already stand. Kings already rule. Civilization is already mature enough to be noisy, populous, and disruptive. The flood responds to excess, not absence. This matters because it tells us how the Sumerians understood catastrophe. The flood is not corrective in a moral sense. It is regulatory. It reduces volume. It imposes constraints where none previously existed. The gods do not destroy humanity because it is wicked. They do so because it is too present, too active, too dense. This framing strips the flood of moral symbolism and anchors it instead in cosmic management. The world before the flood is not portrayed as sinful. It is portrayed as overwhelming. This explains why the texts do not linger on guilt or judgment. They focus instead on procedure. Decisions are made, decrees are issued. One god dissents quietly and preserves continuity through survival rather than reversal. The preservation of a single family and a selection of animals is not framed as a reset button. It is framed as a continuity mechanism. Something must survive so that the world does not fall back into a primordial state. This detail is crucial. If the flood were an origin, there would be no need to preserve prior life. The fact that preservation is emphasized shows that the goal is not renewal, but controlled continuation. The survivor does not step into an empty world to invent civilization anew. He steps into a damaged one and performs rituals that already exist. He offers sacrifices using established forms. He recognizes gods whose authority predates the catastrophe. Nothing about his actions suggests beginning. Everything suggests restoration under constraint. The flood also does not erase memory entirely. The king list resumes. Kingship continues. Cities are rebuilt in familiar places. Names persist. This continuity would make no sense if the flood were meant to restart history. Instead, the flood seals off what came before. It renders earlier conditions unreachable, but not unreal. This sealing is why the antediluvian age becomes so sharply defined. It is not vague because it is mythic. It is distinct because it is inaccessible. The flood creates a hard edge in memory. Beyond it, time behaves differently. The Sumerians respect this boundary. They do not attempt to bridge it with speculation. They do not invent stories to explain what cannot be experienced again. They accept that the world once functioned differently and now does not. This acceptance shapes their entire worldview. They live with the understanding that something fundamental has been lost, not stolen, not corrupted, lost through necessity. The flood is therefore not a punishment. It is an adjustment. This adjustment applies not only to humans, but to the gods themselves. After the flood, divine behavior changes. Gods rely more heavily on ritual offerings. They interact less directly. They impose new limits on human life. These limits are permanent. Mortality becomes fixed. Lifespans are capped. Fertility is regulated. Disease and danger become part of the world. None of these conditions are described as temporary measures. They define the post-flood world. This permanence reinforces the idea that the flood closes an era rather than opens one. It locks the door behind it. The Sumerians never express hope of returning to the earlier state. There is no prophecy of regained longevity, no expectation of restored divine proximity. The past is acknowledged, not anticipated. This is another reason the flood is not treated as an origin. Origins invite anticipation. Boundaries invite resignation. The flood also does not introduce kingship. Kingship already exists before it and continues afterward. What changes is its quality. Authority becomes more fragile. Reigns shorten. Succession becomes frequent. This suggests that the flood affects not just the environment, but the structure of time itself. The Sumerians never describe the mechanism of this change. They do not need to. The effect is obvious. The world no longer allows what it once did. This is why later texts are obsessed with preservation. Writing becomes essential. Ritual becomes precise. Law becomes formalized. These are responses to a world that can no longer rely on inherent stability. The flood creates the conditions that make civilization feel fragile. Before it, continuity is lived. After it, continuity must be maintained deliberately. This shift defines the seventh world. The flood stands between the 6 civilizations that existed under older rules and the one that follows under new constraints. It does not give birth to civilization. It limits it. This limitation is the foundation of history as we recognize it. Finite time, mortal rulers, recorded memory, structured law. All of these emerge not because civilization begins, but because it can no longer assume permanence. The Sumerians understand this instinctively. They do not say, "This is the start." They say, "This is after." Everything meaningful in their record happens downstream of the flood. Everything before it is remembered, but unreachable. That is the function of a boundary. As we move forward, this understanding will become even more important. The seventh civilization does not arise into an empty world. It inherits a narrowed one. A world shaped by loss, restraint and memory rather than abundance and duration. And it is within that narrowed space that the question quietly forms, not of how civilization began, but of how long it can continue, knowing now with certainty that it has already ended before. The antediluvian kings are often treated as the most perplexing feature of the Sumerian record, largely because they do not behave like kings are supposed to behave within modern expectations of history. Their reigns stretch beyond human scale. Their lives exceed biological limits. Their authority appears absolute and uninterrupted. For many readers, this makes them either impossible or symbolic, figures to be explained away rather than understood on their own terms. But when we step back and look at how these kings function within the broader structure of the Sumerian worldview, a different picture emerges. These figures are not meant to be read as exaggerated versions of later rulers. They represent something fundamentally different. The antediluvian kings are not kings in the political sense we are accustomed to. They are not administrators presiding over complex human societies as later rulers would. They are markers. They are anchors. They represent conditions of existence rather than historical personalities. This distinction matters because the Sumerian texts do not treat these rulers as exceptional individuals who rose above their peers. They are never praised for conquest, wisdom, or innovation. Their defining feature is duration. How long they rule is the only thing that distinguishes one from another. This suggests that the reign length itself is the message. In a world where time behaves differently, authority behaves differently as well. The antediluvian kings appear in a period where continuity is embodied rather than maintained. There is no need for succession planning when authority does not expire. There is no need for lawmaking when order persists automatically. There is no need for explanation when the system holds without strain. These kings represent stability so complete that it does not require reinforcement. This is why their reigns are measured in impossible time. The numbers are not simply exaggerations. They signal a condition where authority is not bound to mortality. These rulers exist at the intersection of divine and human, not because they are gods, but because the distinction between divine and human has not yet fully hardened. The Sumerians do not describe these kings as immortal in the later mythological sense. They simply allow them to persist. Death is not yet the defining boundary of a life. Time does not yet enforce limits in the way it later will. This does not mean the antediluvian kings are fictional. It means they belong to a different category of existence. They are remembered as real, but not relatable. Their world is not one humans can return to or even fully imagine. The cities they rule reinforce this idea. These cities are not described as developing or expanding. They are already complete. Each serves as a seat of authority rather than a centre of growth. Kingship moves between them not because of conquest, but because authority itself relocates. This relocation is recorded without narrative. The texts do not say why kingship leaves one city and appears in another. They simply state that it does. This again suggests that kingship is not tied to human action. It operates according to rules beyond human control. The antediluvian kings embody this impersonal authority. They do not negotiate power. They do not struggle to maintain it. They hold it as long as conditions allow. When those conditions change, authority moves on. This perspective helps explain why these figures are not individualized. Their personal lives are irrelevant because individuality itself is less important in a world defined by continuity. Identity is absorbed into role. This absorption becomes clearer when we consider how the Sumerians understood personhood. In later periods, identity becomes more complex. Individuals are distinguished by achievements, failures, relationships. In the antediluvian period, identity is simplified. To be king is to embody kingship. Nothing more is required. This simplification reflects a world where social differentiation has not yet intensified. Hierarchy exists, but it is not contested. There is no need to justify power, because power is not yet experienced as domination. The antediluvian kings therefore represent a form of authority that predates politics. Politics emerges when authority must be negotiated among competing interests. In the antediluvian age, there is no competition. Authority flows smoothly because the system supports it completely. This is why these kings do not legislate. There are no recorded laws attributed to them. Law becomes necessary only when order begins to break down. In a world where order holds, law is redundant. The Sumerians seem to understand this intuitively. They do not retrofit later concepts onto earlier figures. They allow the antediluvian kings to remain strange. This strangeness is deliberate. When later scribes copied the king list, they did not attempt to normalize these reigns. They preserved the impossible numbers faithfully, even when they clearly conflicted with lived experience. This preservation suggests reverence rather than confusion. The scribes were not mistaken. They were recording memory as it was inherited. The antediluvian kings function as boundary markers between conditions of existence. They signal a time when civilization operated under rules that no longer apply. Their reigns define the scale of loss. This loss is not framed emotionally but structurally. After the flood, nothing like these reigns ever appears again. The possibility itself disappears. This disappearance is not reversible. The antediluvian kings are therefore not models to emulate. They are reminders. They show what authority looked like before mortality and limitation became dominant features of existence. Their presence in the record serves to contextualize everything that follows. When later kings rule for decades instead of millennia, the contrast is not accidental. It is meaningful. The Sumerians do not say, "We live shorter lives now." They show it by comparison. This comparative approach appears throughout their texts. Meaning is conveyed through juxtaposition rather than explanation. The antediluvian kings are placed beside post-flood rulers so that the difference becomes self-evident. This method reflects a worldview that trusts the reader to notice patterns without guidance. The antediluvian kings also represent a different relationship to memory. When a ruler reigns for tens of thousands of years, memory is embodied. There is no generational break. Knowledge does not need to be transmitted. It persists through presence. After the flood, memory fractures. Writing becomes essential. Genealogy becomes crucial. Lists replace living continuity. The antediluvian kings belong to a time before this fracture. This explains why their memory survives as enumeration rather than narrative. Stories are not needed when continuity is uninterrupted. Numbers suffice. The Sumerians preserve those numbers because they encode a reality that can no longer be experienced directly. They are not statistics, they are symbols of scale. This scale is temporal, but it is also existential. It describes a world where existence is not rushed, where urgency does not define action, where planning across generations is unnecessary because generations blur together. Such a world would feel fundamentally different from the one the Sumerians inhabited. They lived with deadlines, with seasons, with mortality, with succession. The antediluvian kings remind them that this was not always the case. This reminder does not lead to rebellion or despair. It leads to adaptation. The Sumerians accept their limits. They build institutions to manage them. Writing, law, ritual, and memory all serve this purpose. The antediluvian kings also help explain why the flood is treated as irreversible. The flood does not merely destroy cities, it destroys a condition of time. Once time contracts, it cannot be expanded again. No ritual restores it. No god reverses it. This finality gives the antediluvian kings a special gravity. They belong to a closed chapter. They are not ancestors in the usual sense. They are predecessors in kind. This is why they are not worshipped as heroes. They are not celebrated in hymns. They are recorded. Recording, in the Sumerian worldview, is an act of respect. It acknowledges reality without embellishment. The antediluvian kings are acknowledged as having existed under conditions that no longer apply. That acknowledgement shapes how the Sumerians understand their own place in time. They do not see themselves as fallen from perfection. They see themselves as living under new rules. This distinction is subtle, but important. It avoids nostalgia. It avoids resentment. It frames loss as transformation rather than punishment. The antediluvian kings represent the last moment when civilization could exist without constant maintenance. Their disappearance marks the point where effort becomes unavoidable. This effort defines the post-flood world. As we move forward, the meaning of these kings will become even clearer. They are not meant to be decoded into literal chronologies or dismissed as myth. They are structural elements in a philosophy of history. They tell us that civilization is not singular. It changes its relationship to time, authority, and memory across different conditions. The antediluvian kings embody one such condition, a world where continuity was so complete that it did not require defense. That world is gone. What follows is not chaos, but constraint, a narrower existence where stability must be worked for, preserved and recorded. Understanding what the antediluvian kings actually represent prepares us to understand why the seventh civilization, the one that follows the flood, feels so different from everything that came before. It is not younger because it begins. It is younger because it has less time, and living with less time changes everything. Time, in the Sumerian worldview, is not a neutral backdrop against which events unfold. It is an active condition of existence, something that can stretch, compress, fracture, and reconfigure itself when the world passes through certain thresholds. Each reset does not merely alter what happens within time, it alters time itself. This is one of the most difficult ideas to grasp from a modern perspective, because we are accustomed to treating time as fixed. Seconds follow seconds. Years accumulate predictably. History moves forward at a constant pace regardless of what occurs within it. The Sumerian texts do not share this assumption. For them, time behaves differently depending on the state of the world. Before the earliest transitions, time barely needs to be measured at all. In the first and second conditions, duration exists, but it does not dominate experience. There are no reign lengths to count, no generations to track. Time does not impose urgency, it simply holds existence in place. As structure emerges and responsibility enters the world, time begins to matter more. It becomes something that can be organised, segmented, and eventually measured. But even then, it does not constrain life in the way it later will. In the third condition, time supports order without limiting it. Continuity remains intact. The first major distortion occurs with the emergence of the fourth civilization. Time stretches to an extreme degree. Reigns last for tens of thousands of years. Authority persists without renewal. Memory remains embodied rather than transmitted. In this condition, time is expansive but stable. It does not rush. It does not press. It does not threaten. This expansion is not treated as miraculous. It is treated as normal for that world. The Sumerians do not marvel at it. They record it. What matters is what happens when this condition can no longer be sustained. The end of the fourth civilization marks the first major reset of time. After this point, duration contracts. Reigns shorten. Succession accelerates. The world still functions, but it no longer allows existence to unfold across immense spans without interruption. This contraction does not occur all at once. It unfolds across the fifth condition, where time begins to feel finite but not yet oppressive. Continuity still exists, but it must be managed. Authority passes more frequently. Memory starts to thin. This gradual shortening is itself a form of reset. It signals that the underlying rules governing existence have changed. The world still resembles its earlier form, but it no longer supports the same temporal scale. The Sumerians do not explain why this happens. They do not speculate about causes. They simply record the effect. Time has changed. The sixth civilization inherits this altered time fully. Here, duration becomes something that must be tracked precisely. Reign lengths are counted carefully. Generations matter. Succession becomes unavoidable. Time is no longer expansive enough to absorb activity without consequence. This is the first condition where time becomes a source of pressure. Human population grows, activity increases, noise fills the world, the system strains under the weight of compressed duration. The same amount of activity that once unfolded comfortably across vast spans now crowds into shorter intervals. This crowding creates tension, not because humanity behaves differently, but because time no longer stretches to accommodate it. The flood marks the most dramatic reset of all, not because it destroys cities, but because it permanently redefines how time behaves afterward. After the flood, time becomes narrow. Lifespans shorten abruptly. Reigns shrink to decades rather than centuries. Mortality becomes fixed. Succession becomes constant. Memory fractures. Writing becomes essential. This is not a temporary adjustment. The Sumerians never suggest that time might expand again. The post-flood world is defined by limitation. This limitation applies universally. Humans experience it most acutely, but gods are affected as well. Divine interaction becomes less direct. Intervention becomes more structured. The ease of presence that characterized earlier worlds is gone. Time after the flood does not simply move faster, it enforces boundaries. It limits what can be accomplished within a single life. It makes continuity fragile. This fragility is the defining feature of the seventh world. What is crucial to understand is that each reset does not erase time and start it over. It reshapes it. The past remains real, but inaccessible. The future remains open, but constrained. The Sumerians do not treat resets as failures. They treat them as transitions between different operating conditions. Time, in their understanding, is not linear progress. It is layered reality. Each layer supports different forms of existence. Some layers allow immense continuity. Others allow only brief persistence. None are inherently superior. They are simply different. This perspective explains why the Sumerians never express outrage at shortened lifespans. They do not frame mortality as injustice. They accept it as a condition of the current world. They know from their own records that other conditions once existed, but they do not expect them to return. This acceptance shapes their entire culture. It encourages preservation over ambition, memory over innovation, stability over expansion. When time is limited, accumulation becomes dangerous. Overgrowth leads to strain. Excess invites correction. The flood is one such correction, but it is not unique. Smaller resets occur throughout the record. Cities fall, dynasties end, authority shifts. Each of these events carries a temporal consequence. After each disruption, time feels slightly more constrained. The Sumerians encode this understanding through comparison. They place earlier and later reigns side by side. They allow the contrast to speak. This is why the king list is structured the way it is. It is not merely a political document. It is a record of how time itself has changed. The list begins with immense spans and ends with human-scale durations. The transition is stark. The message is implicit. Time is not what it used to be. This realization gives the Sumerian worldview its distinctive tone. It is neither optimistic nor despairing. It is sober. Civilization exists, but it exists under conditions that have already tightened multiple times. Each reset leaves less room to maneuver. The seventh world inherits the narrowest time yet. Lives are short. Memory is fragile. Continuity requires effort. This does not make civilization meaningless. It makes it precious. The Sumerians respond to this by building systems designed to resist temporal erosion. Writing preserves memory. Ritual maintains alignment. Law stabilizes behavior. Kingship enforces continuity. All of these institutions arise not because civilization is beginning, but because it has already ended before. The knowledge that time can change creates urgency without panic. The Sumerians do not rush. They endure. They know from their own record that endurance itself has limits. This knowledge also shapes how they view the future. They do not imagine infinite progress. They imagine maintenance. Holding the world together for as long as conditions allow, Time after each reset becomes more restrictive, but also more deliberate. When duration is limited, intention matters. This is why the seventh civilization feels so different from the ones before it. It is not weaker because it is younger. It is constrained because time has been reshaped. Understanding this prepares us to look at the next question more clearly. If time has changed repeatedly, if each reset narrows what is possible, then civilization is not simply something that happens once. It is something that must adapt to the conditions of time it inherits. The Sumerians lived with that understanding constantly. It shaped how they wrote, ruled, worshipped, and remembered, and it raises a quiet implication that lingers beneath everything they recorded. If time has already been reset multiple times, then the current condition is not guaranteed to be the final one. What has changed before can change again. The Sumerians never state this directly. They do not need to. The pattern is already there. And that pattern leads naturally to the next layer of the story, where knowledge itself is no longer something that can arise spontaneously, but something that must be carried forward deliberately because time will no longer protect it on its own. In the Sumerian texts, knowledge is never treated as something newly discovered. It is not framed as the result of curiosity, experimentation, or gradual improvement. Instead, it is consistently described as something that already exists before humans fully understand it. Something that must be received, preserved, and passed on. Knowledge does not originate within a single lifetime. It arrives from elsewhere and moves forward through inheritance. This pattern is so consistent that it becomes invisible unless one is actively looking for it. Instructions are given, not invented. Skills are taught, not developed. Wisdom is remembered, not uncovered. Even when new techniques or systems appear in the record, they are almost always attributed to earlier authorities, divine sources, or ancient precedent. The implication is clear. Knowledge belongs to the past before it belongs to the present. This framing is not humility in the modern moral sense. It is structural realism. The Sumerians understood that their world operated under conditions of shrinking time. After each reset, after each contraction of duration, the space available for experimentation narrowed. When time is abundant, discovery can be slow. When time is limited, discovery becomes risky. What already works becomes more valuable than what might. This is why inheritance becomes the dominant mode of knowledge transmission. In the earlier worlds, particularly the fourth civilization, knowledge did not need to be transmitted deliberately. Continuity was embodied. Authority persisted. Memory lived within individuals who endured for immense spans. Skills and understanding did not pass between generations, because generations barely existed in the modern sense. Knowledge stayed present because its holders did not disappear. Once time began to shorten, that condition vanished. The fifth and sixth worlds inherit a problem that did not exist before. Knowledge can now be lost. This loss is not theoretical. The Sumerian record is shaped by it. The obsession with lists, with copying, with preserving exact wording, even when meaning has become obscure, reflects an anxiety about disappearance. Knowledge is fragile now. It cannot be trusted to survive without effort. This fragility explains why the Sumerians never describe themselves as inventors. To invent is to claim novelty. To claim novelty is to admit uncertainty. In a world where stability has already been lost once, uncertainty is dangerous. Instead, authority rests in antiquity. What is old is reliable. What has lasted is legitimate. What can be traced backward carries weight. This is why law is always framed as restoration rather than reform. Even when a king issues new decrees, they are presented as returning the world to proper order, not changing it. The legitimacy of action comes from alignment with what already exists, not from innovation. The same principle governs religious knowledge. Rituals are not designed, they are received. Their effectiveness depends on correct repetition, not creative adaptation. Even when the meaning of a ritual becomes obscure, its form is preserved. Accuracy matters more than understanding. This emphasis on form over interpretation reveals a deep trust in inherited structure. The Sumerians believed that the correct action mattered even if its original rationale had been lost. This belief only makes sense in a world where knowledge has already slipped out of reach before. The gods themselves reinforce this pattern. Divine figures do not invent the cosmos, they inherit roles within it. They receive authority, they maintain order. When they teach humans, they do not create new truths. They pass down instructions that already exist within the cosmic framework. This dynamic positions humans not as creators of civilization, but as stewards of it. Humanity's role is not to push forward into the unknown, but to hold together what has already been assembled. This stewardship becomes especially important after the flood. The seventh world is defined by limits. Lifespans are short. Memory is fragile. Time cannot absorb error indefinitely. In such a world, inherited knowledge is safer than discovered knowledge. The Sumerians encode this understanding in how they treat writing. Writing is not celebrated as invention. It is treated as necessity. It exists to preserve what might otherwise be lost. Its purpose is defensive. Scribes copy texts exactly, including archaic phrases they may no longer fully understand. This is not intellectual stagnation. It is preservation strategy. Meaning can be reconstructed later. Form cannot be recovered once lost. This attitude also shapes how skills are taught. Professions are inherited. Techniques are passed from master to apprentice. Authority rests in lineage rather than novelty. This is not because the Sumerians lacked creativity. It is because creativity is constrained by responsibility. When civilization has already failed before, experimentation carries consequences. The memory of earlier worlds looms behind every act of preservation. The Sumerians know that something vast and stable once existed and no longer does. They live in its aftermath. That knowledge produces caution. This caution is often misread as conservatism or lack of progress. But within the Sumerian worldview, it is adaptive intelligence. When time has contracted repeatedly, stability becomes the highest value. Inherited knowledge carries another advantage. It creates continuity across resets. Even when the world changes, certain patterns survive. Ritual law, kingship, and writing all function as vessels that carry fragments of earlier conditions forward. These fragments do not restore what was lost, but they prevent total collapse. The Sumerians understand this instinctively. They do not seek to rebuild the antediluvian world. They know it cannot return, but they preserve its memory indirectly through structure. This indirect preservation appears everywhere, in the belief that authority descends, in the expectation that order exists beyond human decision, in the insistence that correct practice matters even when explanation fades. Knowledge, in this sense, is not information. It is alignment. To inherit knowledge is to align oneself with the deeper structure of reality as it has been handed down. To invent knowledge is to risk misalignment. This does not mean the Sumerians reject change entirely. They adapt constantly. Cities rise and fall, dynasties change, techniques evolve. But these changes are framed as adjustments within an inherited framework, not departures from it. The distinction is subtle, but critical. Change is acceptable. Severance is not. This worldview also explains why the Sumerians place such importance on teaching and transmission. Wisdom is not meant to remain with individuals. It must move forward. The loss of a knowledgeable person is dangerous unless their understanding has already been transferred. This urgency shapes education. Scribes are trained rigorously. Errors are corrected. Precision is enforced. The goal is not originality, but reliability. This reliability is what allows civilization to persist under narrowing conditions. The Sumerians know, even if they never state it explicitly, that the seventh world is not guaranteed. They have seen 6 conditions pass before it. They know that order can fail. Inherited knowledge is their defense against that failure. It allows continuity even when time shortens. It allows alignment even when direct divine presence withdraws. It allows structure to persist even when memory fades. This is why knowledge is always described as inherited. It must be. There is no other safe way to carry it forward. To describe knowledge as discovered would imply that it could arise spontaneously again if lost. The Sumerians do not believe this. They believe that once knowledge disappears, it may never fully return. This belief is not pessimistic. It is realistic within their framework. The earlier worlds show what is possible. The later worlds show what remains. The 7th civilization stands between those two truths. It inherits knowledge because it cannot afford to recreate it from nothing. As we continue, this understanding of inheritance will help clarify why the Sumerians never describe their own age as final or supreme. They know they are living within constraints shaped by loss. Their task is not to surpass the past, but to remember it well enough to survive. And that task leads naturally to the next realization. If knowledge must be inherited because time is limited, then each civilization will not only lose duration, but also shed portions of understanding along the way. Which raises the next quiet question embedded in the texts. What makes our age different from the ones before, not in terms of progress, but in terms of what it no longer remembers at all? What distinguishes our age from the ones before it is not invention, intelligence, or moral advancement. It is not progress in the sense modern narratives prefer. The difference lies deeper, in something quieter and more consequential. Our age is defined by disconnection, not collapse, not ignorance, but distance. The Sumerian texts do not describe the 7th civilization as new. They describe it as constrained. Everything that defines this world emerges from limitation rather than expansion. Time is short. Memory is fragile. Authority must be justified repeatedly. Knowledge must be taught deliberately. Nothing persists on its own. Earlier worlds didn't share this condition. In the 1st and 2nd states, order did not need to be explained or defended. It existed as the natural condition of reality. In the 3rd, order required administration but not coercion. In the 4th, time itself provided continuity so complete that renewal was unnecessary. Even in the 5th and 6th, despite growing strain, there remained living memory of earlier conditions. The world still remembered what it had once been. Our age does not. This is the defining difference. The 7th civilization inherits fragments, not continuity. We inherit systems without their original context, rituals without explanation, authority without proximity, knowledge without memory of how it was first assembled. The Sumerians were acutely aware of this difference, even though they never state it directly. It is embedded in how they write about themselves. They do not speak as participants in a living cosmic order. They speak as caretakers of something already damaged. This damage is not sudden, it is cumulative. By the time the 7th world emerges, time has already contracted multiple times. Each contraction removes not only duration, but access. The earlier the world, the more complete its access to structure, authority, and alignment. The later the world, the more mediated those elements become. Our age is fully mediated. We do not experience authority directly. We represent it symbolically. We do not experience cosmic order. We ritualize it. We do not embody memory. We record it. This is not failure. It is adaptation to conditions that no longer allow anything else. The Sumerians understand that the 7th world operates under rules that make direct continuity impossible. Lifespans are too short. Generations turn over too quickly. Experience cannot accumulate naturally. Knowledge cannot remain embodied. Everything must move through transmission. This is why writing becomes central only now. In earlier ages, writing would have been unnecessary. Continuity lived inside individuals and institutions that did not expire. In the seventh world, continuity dies with each generation unless it is externalized. Writing is not progress, it is compensation. The same is true of law. Earlier worlds did not require codified law, because order held automatically or through direct authority. In the seventh world, law becomes essential, because alignment is no longer guaranteed. Behavior must be regulated explicitly. This is also why kingship feels different now. Kings no longer embody cosmic authority. They represent it. Their power is limited, contested, and fragile. They must rule through institutions rather than presence. The Sumerians do not see this as corruption. They see it as reality. Our age is not worse because it is later. It is narrower because it comes after loss. This narrowing affects how humans relate to time itself. In earlier conditions, time was something lived within. In our age, time is something we measure against. It presses, it limits, it ends. Mortality becomes unavoidable rather than conditional. The Sumerians are among the first to articulate this clearly. Earlier worlds did not need philosophies of death. Death did not define existence. In the seventh world, death shapes everything. This is why human effort becomes urgent. Agriculture must succeed each year. Records must be preserved each generation. Order must be reinforced constantly. Nothing is allowed to drift. The pressure we feel in our age is not a psychological accident. It is structural. The Sumerians understand that they live in a world where collapse is possible. That understanding does not appear in the earlier ages. There, collapse either does not occur or occurs beyond lived experience. Here it is close enough to be feared. This fear does not produce panic. It produces conservatism. The Sumerians value preservation because they know loss is permanent. Once something disappears now, it does not return in a later reset as it once might have. The flood sealed off the earlier conditions. The seventh world does not cycle the same way. It does not reset easily. It endures until it fails. This is another critical difference. Earlier civilizations existed within a cosmic rhythm that allowed renewal. Later civilizations exist within a linear constraint where failure accumulates. The Sumerians sense this intuitively. They never describe their age as eternal. They never suggest it will last indefinitely. Their texts carry an awareness of finitude. This awareness shapes how they view themselves. They do not imagine they are building toward perfection. They imagine they are holding something together for as long as possible. That posture is unique to the seventh world. Earlier civilizations did not need to think this way because the world itself absorbed error. Time stretched. Authority held. Memory endured. Now, error compounds quickly. This is why the seventh civilization is so focused on order, boundaries, and correct practice. Mistakes matter more now than they once did. This also explains why later traditions emerging from Mesopotamia begin to emphasize morality, responsibility, and obedience. These are not abstract virtues. They are survival strategies. In a world where continuity is fragile, behavior has consequences. The Sumerians do not moralize this excessively. They simply acknowledge it. They live within it. Another difference lies in humanity's relationship to the divine. In earlier worlds, gods are present, active, and direct. They walk among humans, they rule openly, they intervene frequently. In the seventh world, divine presence withdraws. It becomes mediated through ritual, symbol, and memory. The gods do not disappear, but they become distant. This distance is not punishment. It is consequence. The world no longer supports the same level of proximity. This withdrawal changes how humans understand themselves. Responsibility increases. When gods no longer intervene constantly, humans must manage more of existence on their own. This does not make humans more powerful. It makes them more accountable. The The Sumerians reflect this by placing great emphasis on correct action. Ritual must be performed properly. Law must be upheld. Order must be maintained. There is little room for improvisation. This is another difference from earlier ages. Creativity becomes constrained, not because imagination disappears, but because risk becomes costly. The seventh world values reliability over brilliance. This is why the Sumerians do not present themselves as innovators. They do not claim to surpass earlier worlds. They claim to preserve what they can. The idea of progress, as later civilizations will frame it, does not exist here. There is only survival with dignity. The seventh world is also the first where history feels continuous in a way we recognize. Earlier worlds are segmented by conditions. This world flows forward without reset. That continuity creates anxiety. If there is no reset, then mistakes accumulate. Loss compounds. This makes memory sacred. The Sumerians respond by turning memory into institution. Writing, ritual, genealogy, law, and education all exist to fight erosion. This is the defining labour of our age. Not conquest, not expansion, not creation, maintenance. This does not mean the seventh civilization lacks meaning. It means its meaning is different. Its value lies not in what it builds, but in what it keeps from disappearing. The Sumerians live with the knowledge that 6 civilizations came before them, not as legends, but as conditions of reality that no longer apply. They do not expect those conditions to return. They do not expect time to expand again. They do not expect authority to descend directly again. They do not expect memory to persist naturally again. They accept that this world is narrower, and within that narrowness, they work. They build cities knowing they will fall. They write texts knowing they may be misread. They perform rituals knowing the gods are distant. They rule knowing kingship is fragile. This acceptance is what makes their civilization recognizable to us. We live in the same condition. The difference between our age and the ones before is not technological. It is existential. We live after loss. The Sumerians knew this. They did not dramatize it. They didn't complain. They structured their world around it. And by doing so, they left behind a record that does not promise renewal, but teaches endurance. That endurance carries us forward into the final consideration, the quiet realization that if our world is shaped by inherited loss, rather than fresh beginnings, then the most important question is not what came before, but what continues to erode without being noticed, which leads inevitably to the last reflection, where the story does not conclude, but settles, asking not for answers, but for awareness as we consider what it means to live as the seventh, knowing that 6 worlds have already slipped beyond reach. When the Sumerian texts imply that civilization has restarted before, they never frame those restarts as clean renewals. Nothing returns whole. Nothing comes back intact. Each transition leaves behind absences that cannot be repaired, only accommodated. What is lost is not always dramatic, and it is almost never named directly. Loss accumulates quietly, embedded in changed conditions rather than recorded events. The first loss is always time. This is the most consistent pattern across every reset. Time contracts, duration narrows. What once unfolded slowly and without urgency becomes compressed into shorter spans. Lives shorten, reigns shrink, generations turn over faster. With each restart, less can be carried forward simply by existing long enough. This loss of time reshapes everything else. In the earliest conditions, continuity did not need to be managed. Memory lived inside beings who endured. Experience accumulated naturally. Knowledge stayed present because its holders did not vanish. Once time shortens, continuity fractures. Knowledge must be transferred, and transfer always risks distortion. So the second loss is memory. Not memory in the sense of forgetting facts, but memory as lived awareness. The kind of knowing that comes from direct participation in long cycles. That kind of memory disappears early and never returns. What replaces it are records, stories, lists, rituals. These preserve fragments, but they do not replace experience. The Sumerians seem acutely aware of this. Their texts are filled with careful copying, exact repetition, and obsessive preservation. These are not cultural quirks, they are responses to loss. With each restart, memory becomes thinner and more indirect. The third loss is proximity. In earlier worlds, the boundary between divine and human is minimal. Authority is present. Order is felt rather than inferred. Guidance is direct. As conditions reset, this proximity withdraws. Gods become administrators, then overseers, then distant authorities accessed only through ritual and symbol. This withdrawal is not framed as abandonment. It is framed as consequence. The world no longer supports the same level of closeness. With each restart, humans stand further from the sources of order. The fourth loss is coherence. Earlier civilizations exist within systems that hold together without constant effort. Roles are clear. Authority is accepted. Alignment is natural. As resets accumulate, coherence must be enforced. Rules multiply. Institutions expand. Enforcement replaces assumption. This is not because humans become worse. It is because the system itself no longer stabilizes automatically. The Sumerians do not complain about this. They adapt to it. But the adaptation itself signals loss. The fifth loss is simplicity. This does not mean early worlds were easy or undeveloped. It means fewer layers were required to sustain existence. As conditions narrow, complexity increases. More systems are needed to achieve the same level of stability. More work produces less certainty. Each restart leaves behind a world that requires more effort to function. The sixth loss is silence. Earlier worlds leave fewer explanations because they do not need them. Later worlds generate more text, more commentary, more instruction. Silence becomes dangerous because it allows forgetting. The Sumerians respond by filling space with record. But this filling also signals that something has been lost. When a world must explain itself constantly, it is no longer self-evident. The seventh loss is confidence in permanence. This loss does not appear suddenly. It builds gradually. Earlier civilizations seem to assume continuation. Later ones do not. By the time the seventh world emerges, impermanence is understood as a baseline condition. This understanding shapes behavior profoundly. The Sumerians do not build as if things will last forever. They build to endure as long as possible under constraint. They do not expect restoration. They expect maintenance. This expectation marks a fundamental shift in how civilization understands itself. Across all these losses, one pattern holds. Nothing essential ever returns fully once it disappears. Each restart preserves structure, but sheds capacity. What survives is enough to function, but not enough to restore what was. This is why the Sumerians never describe progress as recovery. They do not believe earlier conditions can be regained. They accept that each world inherits less room to operate. The losses are cumulative. Time shortens, memory thins, proximity withdraws, coherence requires enforcement, complexity increases, silence vanishes, permanence dissolves, and yet civilization continues. This continuation is not triumphant, it is resilient. The Sumerians never ask why these losses occur. They are not interested in blame, they are interested in pattern. What matters is not the cause, but the consequence. Civilization survives by adapting to loss, not by reversing it. This understanding explains why the Sumerians place such value on restraint. Excess has already triggered correction before. Overgrowth has already led to reduction. Noise has already invited silence. They live with the awareness that too much of anything invites reset. This awareness does not lead to despair. It leads to caution. The Sumerians build systems designed to slow erosion, not stop it. Writing preserves memory, but it cannot restore lived continuity. Ritual maintains alignment, but it cannot restore divine proximity. Law enforces order, but it cannot recreate inherent coherence. They know the difference. This knowledge gives their worldview a distinctive calm. They do not rage against loss, they accommodate it. The idea that civilization has restarted before carries with it an implicit warning, not a threat, but a limit. There is a point beyond which accumulation becomes unsustainable. The Sumerians do not dramatize this. They encode it structurally. When they list kings, they shorten reigns. When they describe gods, they emphasize distance. When they record knowledge, they emphasize inheritance. When they frame catastrophe, they treat it as boundary, not rebirth. All of this reflects an understanding that something essential is lost each time, and that loss cannot be undone. The seventh civilization inherits the most constrained condition yet. It inherits the most loss, and it inherits the responsibility to function anyway. This inheritance does not make the seventh world insignificant. It makes it fragile. And fragility, once recognized, changes how a civilization understands itself. The Sumerians do not ask whether civilization can fail again. Their texts suggest they already know the answer. They focus instead on how long stability can be held under narrowing conditions. What was lost each time is not just capacity, but margin. The room to recover, the space to adapt slowly, the ability to absorb error without consequence. Our world operates with the least margin of all. The Sumerians lived with that awareness, even if they never articulated it openly. And that awareness leads naturally to the final quiet thought. Not about beginnings or endings, but about what it means to live within a world that knows it is neither the first nor the last, but perhaps the most constrained, and therefore the most dependent on care, attention and restraint as the story settles into its final reflection. There is a particular stillness that settles in when the idea finally takes shape, not as a theory, not as an argument, but as a condition. The realization that we are the seventh does not arrive with urgency. It does not demand belief. It does not insist on agreement. It simply rests there, quiet and steady, like something that has always been present but rarely acknowledged directly. If we are the seventh, then we are not standing at the edge of history. We are standing within it, surrounded by what has already passed, shaped by what can no longer return. This position does not elevate us, and it does not diminish us. It defines us. The Sumerian texts never say this explicitly. They do not announce that the reader lives in a late world, a narrowed one, a world operating under constraints that did not always exist. They do not need to. The structure of their record already carries that understanding. It is embedded in shortened reigns, in inherited knowledge, in distant gods, in the urgency of preservation, in the absence of beginnings. To be the seventh is not to be last in a dramatic sense. It is to be downstream. Everything we live within has already been shaped. Authority has already descended and withdrawn. Time has already expanded and collapsed. Memory has already thinned. Knowledge has already been reduced to what could be carried forward. None of this is happening for the first time. This is the quiet truth beneath the Sumerian worldview. Civilization is not a singular ascent. It is a series of survivals. If we are the seventh, then what defines us is not originality but responsibility. We inherit a world that no longer stabilizes itself automatically. We inherit systems that require constant attention. We inherit limits that cannot be negotiated away. This inheritance does not mean we are weaker than those who came before. It means we live under different rules. Earlier worlds could rely on continuity. We cannot. Earlier worlds could assume order. We must enforce it. Earlier worlds could lose knowledge and regain it through proximity and duration. We cannot. Loss now is permanent. This permanence is what gives the seventh world its particular weight. When time was expansive, mistakes could be absorbed. When authority was embodied, misalignment could be corrected slowly. When memory lived inside beings who endured, Forgetting was not catastrophic. None of those conditions apply now. We live in a world where error accumulates quickly. The Sumerians understood this. They did not phrase it as anxiety. They did not dramatize it as doom. They built their civilization around it quietly, deliberately, and with restraint. Writing exists because memory cannot be trusted to last. Law exists because alignment cannot be assumed. Ritual exists because proximity no longer does. Kingship exists because authority must be represented even when it no longer descends directly. These are not signs of decline. They are signs of adaptation. To be the seventh is to live in a world where survival depends on care rather than expansion. The Sumerians never speak of endless growth. They never describe progress as accumulation. Their texts do not celebrate novelty for its own sake. Instead, they emphasize balance, limit, and proper measure. These values do not arise in worlds of abundance. They arise in worlds that have already experienced correction. If 6 civilizations existed before, then the 7th is the first to live with certainty that civilization itself is not guaranteed. This certainty changes how everything is perceived. Buildings are no longer expressions of permanence. They are acts of defiance against erosion. Writing is no longer expression. It is preservation. Teaching is no longer optional. It is essential. Even identity changes. In earlier worlds, identity was absorbed into role and duration. In the 7th, identity must be negotiated within short lifespans and fragile memory. People become responsible not just for living, but for carrying something forward. This burden is not spoken aloud in the texts, but it is everywhere present. The Sumerians did not ask whether they were worthy of inheritance. They assumed they were obligated to it. This is the most important shift of all. Earlier civilizations existed because conditions allowed them to. The 7th exists because effort sustains it. This does not make life meaningless. It gives it direction. Meaning in the 7th world does not come from beginning something unprecedented. It comes from preventing something essential from disappearing. This is why the Sumerians valued continuity so deeply. Not because they feared change, but because they understood loss. They knew that something vast had already slipped beyond reach. They lived with that knowledge without bitterness. If we are the 7th, then we are living inside the narrowest margin yet. That does not mean collapse is imminent. It means collapse is possible. The Sumerians never suggest that the 7th world will end the same way as the earlier ones. They do not predict another flood. They do not describe another reset. They simply live as though endurance is finite. This posture is subtle. It does not panic. It does not rush. It focuses. The 7th world values maintenance over ambition, care over conquest, precision over brilliance. These are not weaknesses. They are adaptations to constrained time. The Sumerians built cities knowing they would fall. They wrote texts knowing they might be misread. They taught rituals knowing their meaning might fade. They ruled knowing authority was temporary. This awareness did not paralyze them. It grounded them. If civilization has restarted before, then permanence is an illusion that no longer serves us. What serves us instead is attentiveness. The Sumerians were attentive to seasons, to balance, to signs of excess, to the quiet shifts that precede correction. They did not need catastrophe to tell them when something was wrong. They watched structure. This attentiveness is the inheritance of the 7th. Not certainty, not mastery, attentiveness. If we are the 7th, then our task is not to recreate what was lost. That is impossible. Our task is to recognize what remains and protect it from unnecessary erosion. The Sumerians did not believe earlier worlds were morally superior. They believed they were structurally different. That difference matters. It frees the 7th world from nostalgia. There is no attempt in the text to return to antediluvian conditions, no longing for impossible time, no expectation of restored proximity. The past is acknowledged, not desired. This is a mature stance. It recognizes that living after loss does not mean living without meaning. It means living with constraint. Constraint focuses intention. In a world where time is limited, attention becomes valuable. In a world where memory fades, transmission becomes sacred. In a world where authority withdraws, responsibility increases. The Sumerians did not romanticize this. They accepted it. If we are the seventh, then acceptance is not resignation. It is clarity. Clarity allows effort to be directed where it matters. This is why the Sumerian worldview feels calm even when it addresses immense loss. It does not fight reality. It works within it. The quiet thought before sleep is not a warning and not a promise. It is a position. We are not the first. We are not the centre. We are not the culmination. We are caretakers living inside a narrowed span of time. This does not diminish us. It defines the shape of our responsibility. The Sumerians left behind no manifesto explaining this. They left structure, lists, rituals, patterns, silences. Those silences speak. They tell us that civilization is not guaranteed by ingenuity alone. It is sustained by restraint, care, and attention to balance. They tell us that knowledge survives not because it is powerful, but because it is carried carefully. They tell us that time is not neutral. It changes the rules of existence. They tell us that loss is cumulative and that pretending otherwise invites correction. They tell us that living after 6 worlds have passed requires humility rather than ambition. If we are the seventh, then our world is not young. It is late. Late worlds do not rush. They endure. They do not announce themselves. They maintain themselves. They do not assume abundance. They guard continuity. This is not a dramatic conclusion. It is not meant to be. The Sumerians never ended their records with declarations. They ended them by continuing. That, perhaps, is the final lesson embedded in everything they left behind. Civilization does not end with noise. It ends with neglect. If 6 civilizations existed before, then the seventh survives not by believing it is different in kind, but by remembering that it is different in condition. That memory is quiet. It does not demand action. It shapes it. And in that quiet shaping, there is no urgency, no fear, no promise of renewal. There is only the steady understanding that to live as the seventh is to hold what remains with care, knowing how much has already been lost, and knowing without needing to say it loud that what persists does so not by accident, but by attention. That understanding does not need to be resolved. It does not need to be answered. It simply settles, as the night does, into stillness.